Hey guys, howdy! I hope you're fine. As you've seen in the thumbnail, in this video, we're going to see what if Naruto gains devil with multiple harem girls. I request you to check the author of this fanfic and show some love and support. Name of the story is Demonic Devil by Unknown. Nin 345, do check it out. All details in description. And if you want next part of this series, please leave a like and comment 5 blue emoji. Let's get into the video. Also, check out Patreon for I have upload Naruto X Daenerys Targaryen in censored spicy version. Link in description. 64 hack shouted a brown-haired, white-eyed boy as he threw his palms forward. His opponent, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed boy with whisker-marked cheeks, cried out in pain as he flew backwards and rolled on the ground a couple feet. They were Hyuga Niji, prodigy of the Hyuga clan, and Uzumaki Naruto, Jinchuriki of the Kyubi no Kitsune, respectively. Both were Genin of Konohagakure and were competing in the third part of the Chunin exam. Niji sneered at the slightly shaking form of the blonde who was trying to push himself back to his feet as he said, "This is absolutely pathetic. Someone such as you would never become Hokage. Your dream is absolute foolishness. The fate that is waiting for you is death, not to become Hokage. It's a wonder that there are even people who like you, like my worthless cousin." By this point, Naruto had completely frozen and was beginning to feel a great amount of anger slowly rise up inside him. Niji's next sentence drove him over the proverbial edge. "Losers like the two of you shouldn't even bother trying to fight against what fate has preordained. I still have trouble believing that Hinata-sama thought she could actually amount to some dash." "Shut up," Naruto interrupted in a deathly calm voice. To the amazement of everyone gathered, he managed to get a knee underneath him as he said, "I don't care if you insult me or my dream. It's happened plenty of times before now." He slowly pushed himself up to a standing position, but kept his head bowed, his bangs concealing his face from view as he continued, "But never, and I mean fucking never, insult someone who is willing to try to improve themselves in front of me. Especially Hinata, someone who is willing to get back up after being beaten down like she should never endure anyone's scorn. Even more so when it was her own fucking cousin who provided the beat down and then continued to insult her." Niji's sneer grew in ferocity. "Someone like you could never understand what it's like to be branded with a seal you can never escape." He was once again cut off, a blood-red chakra erupted from and bonfired around Naruto. Every Hyuga in the vicinity who currently was using their Byakugans, including Niji, were astonished when they saw that all of the blonde's tenketsu were being forcibly opened. But just as quickly as it came, the red chakra seeped back into Naruto. "No, Neji, I understand more than anyone else just what you're talking about. But I'm not going to listen to your shit anymore." As he was speaking in his newly acquired deathly calm tone, he began to pulse with a bright white light. "So either shut the fuck up, or I'm going to make you," he finished as he raised his glowing blue eyes to stare penetratingly into Niji's. "Let's get this party started." With that, a bright red light burst from Naruto, blinding everyone in the stadium. When they all could see again, some gasped in amazement at the change that Naruto just went through, while many of the women in the stands had a different reaction. Naruto had shot up in height, whereas before he'd been a measly, for his age of 14 years, 4 feet 11 inches. Now he stood at an impressive height of 5 feet 9 inches. His muscle mass had also increased, leaving his defined muscles for everyone to see. In the stands, women aged in their mid-teens to low 20s were organizing a Naruto fan club. His skin had turned a dull orange color and appeared to now be pebble white, like a lizard skin. His feet tore out of his sandals and seemed to become more beast-like in appearance, with a similar occurrence happening with his hands. But the most startling change was Naruto's head. It had now become remarkably similar to a fox's head, complete with elongated snout and vulpine ears, with some kind of helmet that had slots open for his ears and extended down his jawline. Think a Halo Elite's helmet, but with slots for ears. Finishing off his new physical change was his burning crimson eyes. Also, on his back rested a black as night Zweihander. Blade is 5 feet and the hilt is 1 foot and is positioned diagonally. That looked normal enough except for where the blade met the hilt. A demonic-looking, snarling visage of a fox's face rested there with glowing red eyes that seemed to glare at everything around it. Naruto's clothing had also changed. Now he was clothed in black jacket with blood-red tribal designs running across the cloth, with the hem of the jacket splitting into 3 different sections that braided into what might have been mistaken as tails. And no, he doesn't have a shirt on. On his legs were red pants that had similar tribal designs as the shirt, only in black, while shiny onyx combat boots covered his feet. Naruto looked himself over in a small amount of amazement before he picked up a medium-sized rock from the ground and crushed it into powder with little effort on his part. He grinned ferally at the suddenly nervous Neji. "Well, looks like I just got an upgrade," he said conversationally, his voice holding an eerie, echoing quality to it that sounded at odds with his appearance. Meanwhile, up in the Kage booth, both Kages were surprised at the transformation that Naruto just went through. No conversation was made, as each was busy with his own thoughts. "It would seem that another descendant of Sparta walks among us," were the thoughts of the Sandaime Hokage of Konohagakure, Sarutobi Hiruzen. "I guess Minato didn't lie when he told me the legend of Sparta and how he might be descended from one of Sparta's sons. That boy, I must have him. With his blood or body, I'll finally be able to complete my work on replicating the legendary Devil Trigger," thought the disguised Otokage of Otogakure, Orochimaru of the Sannin, with a disturbing mental chuckle. Back down in the arena, Naruto grasped the hilt of his Zweihander and suddenly felt a brief burst of knowledge flow into his mind. With his feral grin still in place, Naruto swung the large sword off of his back and held it pointed towards the other genin. "Let me show you a little something, Hyuga team," Naruto shouted before he began spinning the Zweihander over his head. Bright blue flames began to gather on the sword before the red eyes of the fox flashed. Naruto took this as a signal and spun while slashing at Neji. A crescent of the blue flames sped towards the Hyuga prodigy, who spun like a top while emitting chakra from his body as he shouted, "Kaiten!" A blue sphere sprung up around the white-eyed boy that managed to absorb most of the damage from the attack. By the time Neji had finished his spin, Naruto had leapt high into the air and was intent on slamming his large sword down onto his opponent. The Hyuga prodigy managed to get out of the way of a downward slash, but was drained from using the Kaiten for the second time during the match along with his other techniques, and as such, was unable to get out of the way in time for Naruto's follow-up attack. With a gut-wrenching squelch of blade piercing body, the Zweihander stabbed into Neji's left shoulder, causing the boy to yell from the pain caused. After the teen's yell had died down, the red-eyed half-devil leaned in close to Neji's ear and asked in a low voice, "Did you know that ever since that day when Hinata watched her father use the curse seal on your father, that she wanted to forever change the Hyuga clan and get rid of the seal along with the separation of branch and main family? It's her dream to do that when she becomes the head of the Hyugas. But in order to get there, she's going to need help and support to get stronger. Think on that, Hyuga Neji." Without giving the wide-eyed boy a chance to respond, Naruto deftly pulled his blade from Neji's body, blood spurting out but missing Naruto for some reason, and spun away from the white-eyed boy, flinging the blood from his sword. Neji slumped to the ground as unconsciousness claimed him. Naruto placed his sword on his back and took a couple steps forward before he looked back at the proctor and said, "He should be fine. I made sure not to hit anything vital." As he finished his statement, Naruto was consumed by another flash of red light. The light died down and revealed a new Naruto. This Naruto's hair color was now a shining silver, with it hanging in a messy fashion that had grown out to reach his shoulders. A slash in. If you need some help visualizing, think of Dante's hairstyle in Devil May Cry 3. His clothing stayed the same, proudly revealing the seal that contained the QB no Kitsune on his six-pack stomach for the world to see. His height shrunk down to 5 feet 6 inches, while his eyes changed back to their normal sapphire blue. The silver-haired half-devil continued his march to the stairs, ignoring the shout that he was the winner as well as the silence that permeated the arena. Halfway up to the competitor's box, Naruto pulled out a slip of paper and wrote something on it. He then called up a Kagebushin that quickly transformed into a white mouse, already aware of what its creator had in mind. As he continued on his way to the competitor's box, he thought on what his transformation, along with a certain conversation he had had changed his outlook on with the Kage Bushin. Immediately after receiving the note from his creator, Mouse Naruto sped into a nearby mouse hole and made his way up to the stands where the spectators sat. Luck was with the Kage Bushin as he arrived not far from where Hinata was sitting. Mouse Naruto's eyes widened, though, when he saw who was sitting next to the Hyuga heiress, the super sexy voluptuous snake mistress of Konoha, Mitarashi Anko. Mouse Naruto took a tiny gulp to steel itself and gather its courage before it scampered to Hinata's legs. Mouse Naruto then began to speedily climb up Hinata's pant leg and was eternally grateful that neither Hinata nor Anko were afraid of mice. Of course, Hinata didn't even notice Mouse Naruto climb up her leg until she heard a small squeak come from her lap. She looked down and saw a tiny white mouse with sapphire blue eyes hold a tiny folded note out towards her. "Is that for me, little one?" the lavender-eyed girl asked as Anko looked on in a small amount of curiosity before the brown-eyed woman's eyes widened in recognition as a smirk settled on her face. Mouse Naruto, meanwhile, nodded his head and held out the note to Hinata. Hinata accepted it and read the following. "Dear Hinata Heim, several recent events, my fight with Niji team included, have opened my eyes, shall we say, to certain things around me. One of those things, well, I'm going to cut right to the point since I'm getting nervous just writing this. Hyuga Hinata, once the Chunin exams are all over with, would like to go out on a date with me? If yes, then nod to the mouse. It's a Kage Bushin, and we'll work out a date and time later. If not, then simply hand the note back to the mouse. I won't hate you or think any worse of you if you do say no, so no pressure. Uzumaki Naruto." Hinata blushed prettily at what the note said while Anko, who had been reading it over the younger girl's shoulder, looked down at the mouse and asked, "Do you think I could tag along?" Hinata looked up at the older woman in slight shock. Sure, the lavender-eyed girl knew Anko, who was only 5 years older than the 13-year-old girl, only because she had showed up with Kurenai at teammates' practices every now and then, but Hinata was left stumped at how Naruto might know the dango-loving woman. Meanwhile, Mouse Naruto shrugged and held up a finger before his eyes glazed over slightly. After a minute, he motioned for the note and, using his chakra, wrote, "Sure, but no antagonizing anyone." Anko pouted at that part. "And be sure to wear something nice." Mouse Naruto then turned his attention to Hinata and cocked his head to the side as he waited for her answer. After a minute of silent debate, Hinata nodded her head. Mouse Naruto saluted and disappeared in a puff of smoke. Once the last dregs of smoke disappeared, Hinata looked over at Anko and asked, "Anko-san, how do you know Naruto-kun?" Anko smiled lightly at the memory of when she had first met the former blonde before she said, "Well, I first met him when he saved something just as important as my life, my virginity." At Hinata's gasp, Anko nodded and continued, "Yeah, I had been out drinking one night with Kurei-chan and was walking home by myself when I was stopped by these 3 drunks who thought that they could have some fun with the snake whore. Since I was only a recently promoted chunin and slightly drunk, I was powerless to stop them. They had just ripped off the last of my clothing and were groping me while preparing to remove their pants when Naruto-kun showed up." She chuckled as she remembered what happened next. He came out of nowhere, launched a kick straight into one of the bastard's balls before turning to the next one, and hit him in the same spot with a block of wood that he had picked up somewhere. Once he saw that his 2 buddies were put down easily, the last tried to run away, only to trip on his pants. Naruto-kun walked over to him and found a still intact wine bottle nearby, which he then shoved up that poor sap's asshole. And Naruto-kun was only 11 at the time. She burst out laughing at that point while Hinata giggled at the justice extracted by her, by Naruto-kun. Anko sighed and said, "Ever since then, Naruto-kun and I would meet up every now and then to usually eat dango. Eventually, he came up with the idea for his Oiroke no Jutsu, and I decided to help him out with it. Until he could get a passable form of a woman, I modeled for him, but once he looked mostly like a girl, I decided to take him to the onsen so he could get a more in-depth look at a woman's naked body." She paused as the smallest of blushes stole across her cheeks. "Naruto-kun also gave me my first kiss, even if it was only a friendly one on the cheek." Hinata nodded, a bright blush on her face at the thought of Naruto seeing her naked. Since something similar had happened to her, She had been out in a flower field gathering flowers when she cut one of her fingers on a thorn from a rose's stem. Naruto had shown up out of nowhere and had bandaged the wound before leaving after giving her a kiss on the lavender-eyed girl's cheek. Hinata decided to tell this tale to Anko, who only nodded with a smile while saying that it sounded like something that Naruto would do. Back with Naruto, the silver-haired boy arrived in the booth just as Mouse Naruto dispersed, causing a happy smile to spread across his face. However, this smile was wiped off when he felt a pulse of something that he couldn't describe. He looked over the competitors and felt the feeling strengthen when his eyes landed on the red-haired Tsunanin. Just then, the proctor shouted, "Will Sabaka no Gaara and Uchiha Sasuke please report to the arena?" Gaara vanished in a swirl of sand while Naruto walked over to and leaned on the railing as he ignored the looks he was getting from the other competitors. What was it I felt just now? He asked himself. It felt similar to that time when I met Kyuubi, but different at the same time. That would be because that boy also contains a demon Naruto, said a seductive female voice from inside his head. What do you mean, Kyuubi? Naruto asked with a small frown. He had met the Kyuubi during the time he had been unconscious after summoning Gamabunta and then rode on the giant toad for nearly a whole day. After their first discussion, the Kyuubi decided to switch to her human form, a fiery orange-haired woman with an absolutely perfect body, large bouncy DD cup breasts, and asked that one could watch for hours without growing bored. At the beginning, there had been a major problem about this. Namely, Kyuubi would never, for any reason, clothe herself in any way. Thus, Naruto was constantly submitted to the sight of a naked woman with fox ears and tails, which had the effect of increasing the orange-haired woman's exoticness. After a while, though, Naruto got used to the sight somewhat, meaning that he no longer passed out with a nosebleed. What I mean, Naruto, is that the Suna boy contains the Ichibi, a desert spirit that can control sand and, to some degree, wind, the fox woman explained. Her voice turned to a concerned nature as she continued. But I've met containers for Shikaka before now, and none of them were as psychotic and blood-crazed as that kid. I'm worried that the seal might be faulty, or there might be a third spirit sealed inside the boy that could be driving the boy crazy. Meanwhile, the proctor, who had been looking down at his watch, saw that the allotted time was up for the Uchiha to arrive. He looked up at the crowd and shouted, "Since Uchiha Sasuke has not arrived to participate in his match, as ordered by the Hokage, he is hereby disqualified from the Chunin exams. Sabaka no Gaara is the winner by default." This statement brought much anger and shouting from the civilians in the stands until Sarutobi stood and let loose a blast of killing intent to quiet the crowd. Enough. Just because Uchiha Sasuke is the last loyal member of his clan does not give him special privileges. As a shinobi of Konoha, he is expected to follow his orders, ones that I gave him, and follow those instructions to the letter. If he is late to something as important as this, and we let him off without punishment, then who knows what else he would choose to be late to. With that, the Sandaime of Konoha returned to his seat and rubbed his forehead in irritation. The disguised Orochimaru looked over at Sarutobi with surprise evident on his masked face as he said, "I find myself surprised at your choice of action, Hokage-san. For what I've heard, many of the people gathered here today were hoping to witness the Uchiha boy battle my son." The Sandaime Fire Shadow narrowed his eyes slightly as he responded, "If I were to show that one genin was able to get away with something like this simply because he's one of the last of the clan, while any other person would have been disqualified anyway, what would that say about my leadership capabilities? And besides," Sarutobi continued, "did you not wish to execute an entire team once simply because one of their members was a minute late to his match?" The false Kazekage smiled. "That's because it was in my village that the incident occurred. Here I have very little power to order anything." Sarutobi nodded. "Very well. Let us go back to enjoying the matches, Kazekage-san." Orochimaru in disguise nodded, and both turned their attention back to the arena floor where the fight between Shino and Kankuro was taking place. Back in the competitor's box, meanwhile, Naruto was continuing his discussion with Kyuubi as Shino's and Kankuro's fight took place. "Kyuubi, do you know anything about what's just happened to me during my fight with Hyuga team? It would seem, Naruto, that you are a descendant of a demon known as Sparta." The vixen in the former blonde's head replied. Sensing her container's confusion, she elaborated. Millennia ago, a demon known as Sparta rebelled against Mundus, the king of demons back at that period of time, and sealed the demon world off from the human world. Sparta then settled down with a human wife and had two sons, Dante and Virgil, along with another named Nero. Dante and Nero went on to protect the human world, while Virgil attempted to gain the powers of their father for reasons he never really revealed. Each of the three brothers had the ability to absorb a demon's soul and transform it into a weapon that they called devil arms. Now, QBE, do you think that I'll also be able to do that? Naruto asked with a hopeful smirk. The vixen just giggled before she said, "Of course you can do it. In fact, you've already done it. Do you think that sword is just for decoration?" Naruto lifted the Zweihander off his back and held it in front of him as he replied, "So this is your devil arm? How could I make it if you're still?" When his train of thought hit that particular point, the teen slapped his forehead. "Never mind. So, do you think I'd be able to do the same with Gaara's demon?" "I think it would be best if you asked right now, Naruto. It'd be best to avoid any future complications," the QB advised. Naruto nodded and made his way over to where the two Suna siblings were standing. Both turned to face him, Gaara indifferently and Temari a little fearfully. The silver-haired half-devil nodded to both and began speaking. "I have a proposition for you, Gaara-san, one that may aid in alleviating the voices within your head." The redhead narrowed his eyes as he asked, "What are you talking about?" Naruto's own eyes narrowed as he irately said, "I'm talking about the fact that the Ichibi no Shikaku is sealed within you and is slowly driving you to insanity." Temari gasped while Gaara subtly shifted his stance. Naruto waved a calm hand as he said, "Quit your worrying, you two. I'm not going to kill him." "Geez, how do you know?" Gaara whispered. Naruto's eyes cut over to Shikamaru. "I assume you've already figured it out, that little secret about me, Shika?" he questioned the lazy Nara. Shikamaru simply nodded his head. "I figured it out when the red chakra sprung up around you down in the arena. Before I only had suspicions, but I figured it'd be too troublesome to worry about since you hadn't gone on a rampage yet." Naruto smiled. "You know that brain's gonna get you killed one of these days, Shika." The Nara only grunted, making the former blonde roll his eyes. Naruto turned his attention back to the Sunanin and said, "I know about your condition, Brother Ichi, simply because I carry the Kyubi no Kitsune." Temari fearfully took a step as if she expected Naruto to suddenly kill her right then and there. "How come you're not insane?" she questioned with a small shout. Naruto rolled his eyes in exasperation as he said, "Insane is one of those things that's based on perception, lady. But unlike your brother here, whose seal is either faulty or there's more than just Shikaka within him, my seal was designed by the best of the best, and I'm pretty sure that the only other entity within my head is a vixen that likes to tease me with the sight of her naked body." He shrugged at Temari's look. "Hey, I've told her to try to clothe herself numerous times, but she just says, and I quote, 'I like to feel the wind tickle my tits and pussy.' What is your proposition, Uzumaki?" Gaara interrupted, not in the least bit flustered by the innuendo, unlike his beet-red sister. Naruto snapped his fingers in remembrance. "Yes, the proposition. You see, during my match with Hyuga team, I apparently awoke my long-dormant Kekai Genkai. Now, aside from my changed appearance and what you saw down in the arena, I can also absorb the souls of demons." He paused to let that statement sink in. "As such, I can free Gaara of his curse of being a Jinchuriki. However, I need to defeat the Ichibi in combat in order to absorb the soul. No, do not listen to him. He is lying and will betray you like everyone else has." Shikaku shouted inside Gaara's head. Gaara gripped his head in pain from the sudden mental onslaught of images the sand demon sent him about people who had attacked him back in Sunagakure. He was nearly startled from this state when he felt a concerned grip on his arm. Looking up, the redhead saw that Temari was looking at him with concern written all over her face, and something clicked inside Gaara. "No, you're wrong, Shikaku," Gaara argued, fighting back against the influence of the One-Tail. "Temari has never betrayed me, and whenever she has been nearby, she has always been concerned about me. I will not listen to your lies any longer." With a visible effort, Gaara drove the Ichibis shouting to the back of his mind. The act left him panting deeply, as if he had just ran an incredible distance in a short amount of time. Temari helped him straighten up from his doubled-over state, something that prompted Gaara to give his first grateful look to his sister for the first time in his memory as he said, "Thanks for always being there, Nachon." Temari was stunned for a couple seconds before she tearfully hugged her little brother. Gaara tentatively returned the hug and looked back at a softly smiling Naruto. "I would very much like to be rid of the Shikaku, Uzumaki." Naruto simply nodded as Gaara continued. "I believe in instances such as these, one usually offers something in exchange for such an important action." Before Naruto could begin to protest, Gaara said, "Suna is going to invade Konoha alongside Odo." This sentence made both Shikamaru and Naruto freeze while down in the arena. Shino was declared the winner after managing to finally have his Kekai devour Kankuru's chakra. Both Shino and Kankuru were carted off to the hospital section of the arena. Shino for a minor poison that the makeup-wearing Sunanin had hit him with, and Kankuru from chakra exhaustion coupled with the drain caused by Shino's bugs. "Will Nara Shikamaru and Sabaka no Temari please report to the arena at this time?" shouted the proctor. Temari left after giving her brother one last glance, riding down on her giant battle fan, while Shikamaru was content to simply forfeit his match. That is, until he felt himself free-falling down to the arena floor before he crash-landed and stared up at the competitor's box, giving Naruto the evil eye. Naruto turned back to Gaara while the proctor called for the start of the match. "What can you tell me about what the invasion will entail?" the former blonde asked. Originally, the invasion was supposed to begin during mine and the Uchihas fight. However, since the match was canceled, the invasion will start during our match. Outside the village, groups of Suna and Odo Nins are preparing to summon giant snakes to bypass Konoha's walls. There are even Odo and Sunanin hidden amongst the crowd at this very moment. Finally, I was supposed to be the main heavy hitter by letting Shikaka take control of my body, Gaara explained in his monotone. "Take control? How would that work?" Naruto asked with a small frown. "If I ever fall asleep or am knocked unconscious, Shikaku will take over control of my body and summon up enough sand to make a physical representation of itself," Gaara explained. He hesitated before continuing. "There is also something else. Last night, my father, the Kazekage, approached me and explained to me what I would be doing for the invasion. However, I noticed that instead of my father's usual scent of the desert and a faint hint of scorpions, he instead smelled like a snake. Does this mean anything to you?" Naruto nodded. "Sounds like one of our missing Nin, Orochimaru." Gaara raised an eyebrow as he said, "That is the name of Odo Geiku's Kage." At Naruto's incredulous expression, the redhead nodded. For a month up until the start of the Chunin exams, Orochimaru would visit Suna and speak with my father about plans for the invasion. However, after the second exam, my father learned a rumor that Konoha had its own Jinchuriki, and since mine is the lowest of the 9, and by proxy the weakest, my father decided to cancel Suna's part in the invasion. Naruto raised an eyebrow in amusement. I guess Orochimaru wasn't too happy about that. The blue-eyed boy then turned his attention to a seemingly random part of the room and asked, "Did you get all that, Ji-san?" A section of the wall shimmered before revealing the form of the Sandaime Hokage of Konoha. The aged leader nodded. "That I did, Naruto-kun. This is grave news indeed, and it seems like Jiraiya's spy network was correct. Edo-sanin, I didn't think he did anything important besides writing those Ika books that you and Kakashi read," Naruto said. Sarutobi snickered at the name, faintly recalling that Minato had called Jiraiya something similar. "Yes, Naruto-kun, Jiraiya's spy network is not only widespread, but extremely efficient at doing its job. The information gathered by Jiraiya's spies has often prevented foolish decisions from being made in the past." The Sandaime informed the new half-devil. Naruto nodded and asked, "What are we going to do, Ji-san?" Sarutobi fiddled with his pipe in thought before he looked up at Gaara and asked, "Do you plan on participating in the invasion on the side of Suna and Odo, Gaara-san?" The red-haired boy shook his head. "No. Uzumaki is making the effort to help me with Shikaku, something that my home village can never claim to have tried to do. I will aid Konoha in this invasion if Naruto manages to remove my demon." The Sandaime nodded and looked back at Naruto. Very well. If you do manage to remove Gara-san's demon, I want you to keep an eye on the Kage's box during your match. The first second you notice something happening up there, join me. I have a feeling that your new abilities could be of great help against Orochimaru, he ordered. Naruto nodded and snapped off a crisp salute. The Hokage nodded at the both of them and disappeared in a poof of smoke. Winner! Sabaka no Temari, shouted the proctor. The Jinchurikis looked down to see a slightly winded Temari standing over a bleeding, cut Shikamaru with her fan poised to crush the Nara's windpipe. Shikamaru was shipped off to the medical section, while Temari made her way back up to the competitor's box. When she arrived, Gaara nodded and said, "Good job, Nachon." The silver-haired teen's eyes widened slightly before she smiled and nodded back at Gaara. "Thanks, Otudo." Naruto smiled ferally at Gaara when the proctor called them down for their match and asked, "Shall we get the party started?" The redhead said nothing, but vanished in a swirl of sand. The blue-eyed boy looked over at Temari and winked at her before back-flipping out of the competitor's box, his coattails flapping wildly in the wind. The blue-eyed Jinchuriki landed solidly on his feet and walked forward to stand across from Gaara. The proctor looked at them both, and after determining that they were ready, brought his hand down with a shout of "Hajime." Nobody noticed the swirl of leaves around the two contests until two people appeared between Naruto and Gaara just as the redhead fired his cork at the former blonde. The shorter figure screamed in pain before dropping to his knees with his hands covering his family jewels. After everyone got over the shock, they recognized the figures as Hatake Kakashi and Uchiha Sasuke, who was still engaged in his effort to pierce the sound barrier. Naruto broke down laughing at the sight, while the proctor glared at Kakashi as he said, "Get your student out of the arena, Hatake." He was disqualified when he didn't show up on time. Kakashi's visible eye widened. What? But Sasuke-kun is disqualified, the proctor flatly stated. He will not be given special treatment here, just because he's the last person of his clan still in Konoha. So get him out of here. We have a match that needs to start. Kakashi was about to sullenly escort the Uchiha, who had finally stopped screaming, when he noticed Naruto still laughing on the ground. Wait, who is that supposed to be? I don't remember any of the competitors having a sword like that, the cycloptic scarecrow said. The proctor glanced over at Naruto, who had picked himself up off the ground, and said, "That's your other student Hatake, the one who managed to show up on time and win his match. Of course, you'd know that if you'd bother to get here on time. Now, for the last time, escort Uchiha Sasuke from the arena." Sasuke looked up and noticed Naruto standing a little bit away, and after what the proctor just said registered in Uchiha's addled mind. With a snarl, the black-haired boy formed 3 hand seals and thought as he gripped his wrist, "The dope can't show me up. I'm a last Uchiha." A high-pitched warble alerted everyone in the arena to Sasuke's actions as a bright blue ball of lightning formed in the boy's hand. With a shout of rage, the Uchiha rushed at Naruto, who was standing there with not a care in the world. Just as Sasuke's arm was about to pierce him, Naruto spun out of the way and brought his large sword down on the Uchiha's outstretched arm with pinpoint accuracy. The misguided Avenger slowed and dropped to his knees as he stared down at his arms, with blood spurting out of where his appendages were now sheared off at the elbows. The shock his mind was currently in was the only thing that prevented him from screaming. Naruto placed his sword on his back, turned towards the two Jounin. "You might want to get some medical attention, Hatake-san. All that blood spurting out of his arms can't be a good thing," the silver-haired teen stated conversationally. Kakashi, meanwhile, was stunned at what just occurred between 2 of his students with the civilians in the crowd, mimicking his action. Of course, almost all of the ninja were silently cheering at what Naruto just did, and could only ask, "Why did you do that, Naruto?" The former blonde just shrugged and said, "He attacked me, and I defended myself. Surely you didn't expect me to let him hit with what obviously looked an A-rank jutsu, similar to your Raikiri, did you?" At his sensei's hesitancy, Naruto snarled, "You really did, didn't you? What kind of fucking sensei lets one of their students attempt to kill the other? Get the fuck out of here and take your fucking boy toy with you." Kakashi silently did so and disappeared in a poof of smoke with Sasuke. When they were gone, Naruto turned back to Gaara and said, "Sorry about that. How about we get on with beating the crap out of each other?" Gaara smirked a little and called forth a large amount of sand from his gourd as he said, "Yes, I think I could greatly enjoy that." Naruto smirked right back as he grabbed his Zweihander and twirled it around his body in a fancy pattern. "Let's rock." Naruto rushed forward towards the stock-still Gaara, but sliced his sword down on a wave of sand sent forward by the redhead. The next minute was spent with Naruto fending off the waves of sand until Gaara had the sand surround him in a circle and attempt to bury him. The silver-haired teen just smirked as his sword became covered in bright blue flames, and he placed his feet in a certain position before expelling chakra from the front of one and the back of the other. Then end result being a swirling tornado of blue flames, since Naruto was now spinning like a top. The sand that was trying to crush Naruto quickly turned to glass, leaving Gaara slightly confused as to why Naruto would allow that before the glass cone broke apart and Naruto flew out directly at Gaara. Any further thoughts Gaara had were driven out of his head by the head-popping punch delivered straight to his nose. The redhead flew backwards from the force of the hit, his nose leaving a trail of blood in its wake. For once his hand was too slow to respond to defend him. Naruto rested his Zweihander on his shoulder and smirked at Gaara. "You shouldn't always rely on one single aspect of yourself like that. Show a little variety every now and then." Gaara said nothing as he stood up and wiped the blood from his nose before settling into an odd fighting stance. Shikaku, meanwhile, screaming in his head to be released so that it could kill the former blonde. Naruto watched as the gourd in the redhead's back dissolved and swirled to form 10 battle katars, one for each of Gaara's arms. Gaara noticed the questioning look from Naruto and said, "I've only used these when dealing with pathetic bandits when I wanted a challenge. I wonder how you will fare, Uzumaki." He rushed forward at an impressive speed and engaged the half-devil in a dance of the blade. The two Jinchuriki whirled, twirled, spun, and even rolled on each other's backs while their blades occasionally clashed, both of them extraordinarily agile with their respective weapons. After a couple minutes of fast-paced fighting, the two met in a deadlock. Gaara had his katars crossed to hold back the large blade of Naruto's Zweihander. The two struggled with each other in that position before they both leaped back, panting lightly. Off in the stands, an Anbu looked up at the Kage's box just in time to notice the Kazekage seemingly randomly tap his armrest. The disguised Kabuto relaxed and wondered why he was told to wait to begin the invasion. Naruto smirked and said, "I think it's time to take off the kitty gloves, Gaara." The redhead caught the hidden meaning of the statement and nodded his concurrence. The katars dissolved and the sand quickly formed a sphere around Gaara, while Naruto placed his Zweihander on his back and called forth a small group of Kage Bushins. One clones raised an eyebrow when it caught the faint sound of chanting coming from a sphere. The blue-eyed Bushin moved closer to the sand sphere and went to lean on it, only to get skewered by nearly a dozen spikes. The clone was only able to drop its mouth in shock before it dispersed. The original Naruto dropped to a knee as the memory of getting skewered returned to him. "Ah, fuck, that hurt." Two of his clones moved over to help the original back to his feet. Naruto nodded at his Bushins as they stepped off. "Damn, never gonna do that again. Stung like a bitch. No offense, Tsum-san." The last part was directed up into the stands where the Inuzuka clan was sitting. The head of the clan, a feral-looking woman with an eye-patch-wearing dog sitting next to her, nodded back at the silver-haired half-devil to show that no hard feelings were received. Naruto and his clones returned their attention to the sphere of sand as they began to spread out into a wide circle around the sphere. All of a sudden, the sphere exploded, destroying a couple more of the Bushins, and a giant sand tanuki towered over the arena. The crowd, both shinobi and civilians alike, were stunned into silence by the impressive sight of the giant animal before them. "Well, shit," Naruto muttered to himself as he gazed upwards. He then turned his attention to his clones and gave them some mental commands. The Bushins nodded, and all but one speedily made their way over to the part of the arena wall farthest from the audience. The real Naruto, meanwhile, looked up at the head of the sand tanuki and shouted, "Gaara, are you still in control?" The tanuki nodded its head, and a small trickle of sand flowed down in front of Naruto to form a message. "Yes, but not for long. When I am in this form, Shikaku gets a greater amount of freedom. I'm struggling to hold the one tail back. For how long, I cannot say. Naruto nodded, having noticed the minute shaking of the sand Tanuki's body parts, and looked back up while pointing in the direction his clones had just gone. Follow my clones and get out of the arena. I don't want any of the civilians to get caught in the crossfire. The giant Tanukigara nodded and made its way over to where the clones had gathered before it knocked down a small section of the arena wall and stepped beyond the arena walls. Many of the civilians were confused at that statement. If Naruto was the Kyuubi no Kitsune, then why should he care about whether or not they got hurt? A small amount of muttering broke out amongst the non-chakra users about Naruto. Little did the silver-haired genin know that now only the most die-hard of the civilians still firmly believed that he was the Kyuubi. Naruto, meanwhile, turned to the proctor and said with a confident smirk, I'm going to take the fight outside the arena walls, and since you never said we couldn't, there's nothing you can do. He pointed at his clone and continued, he's going to stay here. If I lose, then he'll disappear. If not, then I'll come back with Gaara slung over my shoulders or something like that. The proctor said nothing as he chewed on his 7 needle for a moment before he nodded. All right, kid. Kick ass and take names, he said with a small smirk. Naruto nodded and sped off to where his clones were currently forming some sort of human chain on the side of the arena wall next to the hole made by Gaara. The blue-eyed Jinchuriki ran up the wall, easily channeling his chakra to his feet so that he could stick to the surface until he came to where his clones were hanging and grabbed the hands of the lowest one. The top clone, as soon as he saw the original was connected, heaved and jumped backwards off the opposite side of the wall, pulling the chain with him. Gravity did its work and pulled the chain of clones over the wall, greatly increasing the speed at which the original Naruto ascended the wall. Once he reached the crest of the wall, the original let go of his hold on his clone's hands and was flung high into the air over the wall, yelling at the top of his lungs. He looked down and saw that he was on target to collide with the giant Sand Tanuki, which raised its head to look him in the eye. Naruto noticed that the teal orbs flashed golden and nodded. The Tanuki nodded back and put its paws together in an odd hand seal, which made the whole body slouch before it snapped back into an alert and ready position as golden eyes were raised to glare at the still falling blue-eyed team. I'm finally free, the Tanuki cried in what was an unmistakably crazy voice. And I'm going to kill you first, descendant of Sparta. I'm going to kill you for turning Gaara against me. The sand creature breathed in deeply, causing its stomach to expand at an alarming rate before it slammed a fist into its bloated stomach. A giant ball of wind was launched from its mouth towards the falling teen at an alarming speed. Naruto's eyes widened as he quickly formed the cross-shaped hand seal needed for summoning his Kagebushins. A single clone shimmered into existence beside the original and quickly joined hands with the real Naruto. The clone expertly spun and flung the real Naruto out of the flight path of the air bullet just in time. The real Naruto flinched when he received the clone's memory. He definitely didn't want to get hit by one of those things. Naruto called forth another Bushin that appeared underneath him. He quickly knelt onto its back and bit his thumb as he gathered his chakra and formed a short burst of hand seals. The silver-haired half-devil slammed his hands down onto his clone's back with a shout of, Nippu, Kuchios no Jutsu. In an extremely large burst of smoke, a gigantic red toad with an odd pipe hanging from his mouth, a tanto hanging at his side, and a dark blue jacket covering his torso appeared, off in the arena. The crowd was stunned into silence at the appearance of Gamabunta. Naruto flinched once more when he received the clone's memory of getting squashed by the Toad boss. Said Toad quickly spotted the Sand Tanuki the crouch just yards away and noticed that the weight on top of his head was lighter than usual. That could only mean, Naruto, you may be my newest Nainotsuji, but why have you summoned me? We still haven't finalized the signing of the contract yet with a drink of sake. Naruto jumped down on Bunta's nose so that the Toad boss could see him as he spoke. The boss of the Toad summons was slightly surprised by Naruto's appearance and stance before a flash of recognition entered his yellow eyes. Just like Minato. Looks like the tadpole has discovered his heritage, the old Toad thought. I know that, Gamabunta Taisho, and the next time that I summon you, I'll have a bottle of sake ready. But right now I need your help, Naruto said. He pointed over at the sand tanuki and continued. Over there is the Jinchuriki of the Ichibi no Shikaku, and this is the avatar of the Bijou sealed within the container. I promised him that I would remove the demon from within him so that he could live a more normal life. Unfortunately, I need to beat the demon in combat, and currently, I'm too small to make a real impact against the giant tanuki. Gamabunta murmured, his pipe twitching in thought. Suddenly, he drew out his tanto and held it in a guarding stance. Well, I must say that the reason you summoned me is definitely better than what Jiraiya usually has. All right, I'll help you out, Naruto. Just remember to bring the sake the next time you summon me. You might want to head to the top of my head for this. Naruto did as told, and was glad he did when Gamabunta leapt forward at an incredible speed. The toad's tanto connected with the tanuki's arm and met with resistance for a brief moment before it tore through and disconnected the arm from the torso. The Shikaku replica took the dismemberment pretty well, meaning it began screaming its head off at the toad and the summoner. The tanuki turned toward them with unexpected speed and launched a couple air bullets at them, with Gamabunta responding by leaping straight up into the air and launching his own water bullets at the tanuki. The bullets collided and caused sheets of rain to fall in the immediate area. Unfortunately, one of Gamabunta's bullets missed one of Shikaku's air ones. Naruto saw this and noticed that it was too close for Gamabunta to stop with a water bullet and jumped down to the toad's nose while channeling his chakra into his sword. Once the blue flames had spread over the blade, Naruto swung his Zweihander at the approaching air bullet and released a crescent of blue flames that swept right through the bullet, absorbing the air generated by the bullet as it sped straight for the sand tanuki. The empowered crescent of blue flame collided with the arm that the Shikaku had raised in defense, transforming a part of that arm into glass before the glass cracked and eventually shattered. Naruto noticed this, and his brow furrowed in thought as a plan concocted itself in his mind. One that would seem utterly ridiculous if he tried to put words to it, but he was almost 100% sure it would work. Gamabunta, meanwhile, grunted as he landed back on the ground. Ugh, I haven't moved like this in years. When I get back to Mayabo-Kuzan, I'm gonna gather up some toads for sparring. Gotta get back into shape. He glanced down at his henchman and noticed the poise, as well as the facial expression he had taken, and chuckled inwardly. If there's any bit of Minato in him, then I'd say that the Bozu has just conjured up some crazy-ass scheme that normal people wouldn't think of attempting. The silver-haired teen turned slightly to look the toad boss in the eye. Gamabunta Taisho, I need you to get me close to that tanuki. I have an idea, but it involves me being on his body. The red toad said nothing for a moment as it watched the sand tanuki begin to reconstruct its arms. It's going to be hard for me to get a grip on him, Naino Tsuji, and I don't think it would be pleasant for you if you try to jump off me if I try to jump over him, Gamabunta mused. But if we were to do a combo hinge, then I could latch onto him real quick. Naruto raised an eyebrow in interest. A combo hinge? The toad boss nodded. You use the hinge no jutsu to transform me into something with teeth and claws. I'll provide the chakra for most of the jutsu. You just focus on the image and channel a small amount of your chakra into me when I say so. Naruto placed his sword back on his back and formed the ram hand seal as he said. Sounds like a plan, Taisho. Let's do it. Immediately, a possible candidate sprung to mind for the toad boss's request, but a quick glance showed that they were still inside of the arena. So Naruto decided that maybe a nine-tailed fox wouldn't be a good idea for a hinge, and instead settled on a different canine. Gamabunta gathered his own chakra before he leapt forward at the tanuki. When he was certain that the sand creature couldn't dodge or have enough time to fire off a jutsu, the toad boss shouted, "Now, hinge!" A giant cloud of smoke surrounded the toad and his summoner before a giant white wolf soared out of the cloud and latched onto the sand tanuki. In another cloud of smoke, the wolf reverted back to being a toad, while Naruto, switching to his devil trigger form, leapt up onto the Shikaku's head and leapt down to the tanuki's neck as blue flames gathered on his sword. Once he reached his destination, Naruto quickly stabbed his Zweihander into the tanuki and dragged it through the sand body as he released a crescent of flames that sped away, still clinging to the tanuki's body and turning the sand it touched into glass. He quickly spun and repeated this maneuver in the opposite direction with similar results. The red-eyed half-devil then stabbed his blade, still covered in the blue flames, once more into the sand, and began running down the Shikaku's back, sand turning to glass with every step. Halfway down the Tanuki's back, Naruto stopped before he spun in a circle, releasing a pulse of blue flame that spread out from his position. Naruto pulled his sword out of the Shikaku's body and jumped into a nearby tree as he watched the blue flames turn the sand into glass and disengaged his devil trigger. Gamabunta noticed this and waited until everything but the head had turned to glass before he brought a webbed hand down to smash the mostly glass creature. Both summon and summoner watched the head of the Shikaku fall to the ground and attempt to recover itself before it screamed in anger. Naruto leapt down and walked over. Panting heavily from the drain his chakra stores had suffered from summoning Gamabunta and constantly conjuring his Zweihander's blue flames, not to mention using his devil trigger again. The blonde-haired teen nodded in thanks to the Toad boss, who nodded back before promptly vanished in a cloud of smoke back to the summons realm. Naruto soon stood in silence before the head of Shikaku, waiting for it to speak. The Tanuki head glowered at him as silence permeated the air before it grudgingly admitted, "You really are a descendant of Sparta. To think his blood still flows in you, and that one other boy." This admission got Naruto's attention. Another person had Sparta's blood running in their veins. "You may use me to aid you, but I warn you now. Harm Gaara again, and I will find a way to kill you." With that, the Shikaku's head dissolved, leaving behind Gaara's unconscious body, and all of the sand that made up Gaara's Suna no Yoroi came together and formed a tan ball of light. Naruto smirked as he extended a hand towards the ball, which started floating into his outstretched hand, and said, "I think QBE is going to make you regret that statement." He closed his hand on the ball, and a brilliant flash of light took over the clearing. The light died down to reveal Naruto and Gaara still in the small clearing only now. Instead of a Zweihander, the silver-haired Jinchuriki was holding, from what he knew from reading history books on weapons, was a tarred shield except for a small difference. Spread out at an equal distance around the edge of the shield was 3 curved blades that looked extremely sharp. Slightly curious, Naruto began spinning the shield while channeling a small amount of his chakra into, and was rewarded with a small tornado of sand launching forward, decimating a couple of trees. Naruto looked down at the shield and then back at the devastation caused as a savage grin spread across his face. He focused on what his Zweihander felt like and watched as the shield vanished, being replaced by his fox-hilted Zweihander. Seems I can only use one devil arm at a time. I'm going to have to work on the speed at which I can switch them then," he thought. "QBUE, are you there?" The blue-eyed teen heard sounds of grunting before the Ninetales' panting voice could be heard. "Hello, Naruto. Could you come back later, please? I'm a little busy at the moment." Before he could reply, Naruto heard the sounds of grunting continued. The teen was tempted to peek in to see what was going on, but decided against it when remembered what happened the last time he had irritated the vixen. Shaking his head at the bijou might be doing, Naruto walked over to the prostrate Gaara and slung the redhead up onto his shoulder in a fireman's carry. Once he was sure that he wasn't going to drop the Sunanin, Naruto began making his way back to the arena. Back at the arena, the crowd waited with bated breath while the Kagebushin, left behind by Naruto, managed to provide a play-by-play, since all the clones shared a mental connection with their creator. Suddenly, the clone's head snapped up as a smirk made its way onto its face. His creator rocked. The proctor noticed and asked, "What's up?" Something happened. Boss defeated Gaara and is on his way back to the stadium. The clone simply replied, receiving a nod from the proctor in response. Up in the stands, a black-haired genin wearing a black t-shirt and blue kung fu pants underneath a hospital robe irately scratched at the cast covering his left arm with a small frown. Ever since he had woken up after his fight with the Sunanin, known as Sabaka no Gaara, Rockley had found that his entire left arm itched a great deal, almost as if something was trying to get out. The itch had worsened after he had witnessed Naruto's activation of his devil trigger during Naruto's fight with his teammate Neji and had gotten nearly unbearable during the current fight. The black-eyed genin wondered why his leg didn't feel the same as his arm, but put it out of his mind as he watched Naruto re-enter the arena with Gaara slung over his shoulder. Guy noticed his prized Deshi's downcast attitude. Lee, is there something the matter? You should be proud of Naruto-kun for expressing his flames of youth by defeating both of his opponents. That's just the thing, Guy-sensei, Lee replied. Naruto-kun has managed to prove his flames of youth by defeating both Gaara-san and Niji, while I could not. I know that I've never removed my weights or used Two-san's sword while fighting against Niji, but now I wonder whether or not I can actually beat him if I do use them. Can I really become a great shinobi if all I use is taijutsu? The black-haired jounin silently gazed at the downcast boy that he would proudly proclaim to anyone was like a son to him, before looking back down at the arena, where Naruto had just been declared the winner of the match and was proceeding to slap the red-haired Sunanin in order to wake the unconscious boy up. Don't give up on what you believe in, Lee. Sometimes the only thing that can keep one going in a fight is their belief in themselves and their abilities, Guy sagely stated. Naruto-kun is prime example of this. He believes with all of his heart that he will become Hokage one day, and so he trains himself in order to move forward and never looks back. In fact, I have seen him do training methods that you and I might find ridiculous. All of the competent shinobi in the crowd suddenly sprung into alert stances when they saw the feathers float down from out of nowhere. Those that were able dispelled the Jinjutsu from themselves and their comrades. Guy did it for Lee when he saw the black-haired boy begin to succumb to the effects of the technique. When the boy was alert, Guy commanded, "Take care of yourself, Lee, and if possible, try to make your way to Tenten." With that, the black-haired jounin leapt off to take care of the Odo and Sunanins that suddenly appeared in the arena. Lee nodded to himself and, after removing his hospital gown, began to make his way to where he felt his teammate's chakra signature was. He arrived in time to see the brown-haired girl grapple with another shinobi using a couple of the various weapons she carried with her. However, because of her predicament, Lee saw that she was unaware of the Sunanin attempting to sneak up behind her. The black-haired genin quickly pondered how to alert his teammate, since the din of battle definitely would have masked any verbal assistance, before his face settled into a grim mask as he reached for his chakra stores. Tenshan is definitely going to kick my butt later for this, he thought with a small amount of amusement before he quietly intoned, "Kaimon Kai." Lee grinned slightly as he felt the energy gained from opening the first gate flood his body. He reached down and picked up a fallen kunai, which he used to cut off the section of his leg cast that covered his knee so that he could move faster. With that out of the way, Lee focused on using the excess chakra to solidify the muscles in his left leg so that he could actually run at an acceptable speed. The genin didn't focus on his arm because he was running enough of a risk pushing the amount of chakra he was into his leg to begin with. With a small grunt, Lee took off running to intercept the Sunanin attempting to sneak up on Tenten. The bun-haired Kunoichi sighed in relief after she managed to slip a kunai past the defenses of the shinobi she was grappling with and slit his throat. She turned and stumbled back in surprise when another nin rose up out of nowhere with a katana poised to stab her. The man was just about to thrust the blade forward when Lee came flying in and stopped him with a two-footed kick to the face. Lee landed on the ground with a small stumble and quickly stabbed the nin with the katana the nin just dropped. He turned to brown-eyed teammate and gave her a small wave. "Hey there, Tenshan. I hope your flames of youth are still burning enough to continue to fight." Tenten just shook her head at her teammate's antics. "Honestly, Lee, only you would fight in an invasion with a cast on your leg and arm. How are you even able to move right now?" she asked with a gesture at his casts. The black-haired genin just gave her a thumbs up with his right hand. "I released the first gate and focused the energy down into my leg so that I could help you out, Tenshan. I could not dampen my flames of youth by letting that man attack you from behind." He smiled widely at her at the end of his sentence. The bun-haired girl shook her head with a small smile. "Only you, Lee. Only you." She looked around at the fighting around them and noticed the purple box that had suddenly appeared on top of the Kage's box. "Well, there's no point in standing here. Let's go help out. And try to be careful, Lee," she pleaded of him with a small frown. Lee went over to her and laid a hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry, Tenshan. With you fighting by my side, I know nothing will happen to either of us." He then picked up the katana he had just killed with and held it up. "It's not Two-san's sword, but it'll do. Let's go Tenchan. With Naruto, a couple minutes earlier, Naruto finally succeeded in waking up Gaara after slapping both of his cheeks multiple times. Needless to say, the redhead glared at the silver-haired half-devil as soon as he was awake. Naruto just grinned cheekily at him and helped the Sunanin up. At this point, the Jinjutsu activated. Naruto and Gaara just sent out a pulse of their chakra to keep themselves from being affected. Hook up with your sister and go wait with your brother. If you make your intentions clear that you're not going to be participating in the invasion, then no Konohanin should attack you three. I don't know about your own village or the Odonins. Naruto finished with a shrug. Gaara just nodded and sand-shushened up to the competitor's box to meet up with his sister. The blue-eyed teen nodded over at the proctor, who nodded back before heading off to fight, and then made his way to the Kage's box. He arrived at the entrance to where the two Kages had been sitting and waited in the staircase while Orochimaru gave his speech about windmills. It seriously sounds like this idiot fucking rehearsed for this moment. Naruto thought with an eye roll before he caught the sound of other people landing on the roof. After quickly figuring that they weren't Umbu, Naruto leapt up onto the roof just as they finished the last hand seals of sequence they had been told to do and threw himself to the side of Sandaime. A purple barrier came into existence just as Naruto landed next to the Hokage, and a group of Umbu appeared on the roof. The four Odonins, assisting Orochimaru, quickly put up protective barriers around themselves to make sure that the Umbu didn't tear down the barrier. The pale-skinned Snake Sannin smiled at the sight before him. Naruto-kun, what an unexpected surprise. I was hoping you might show up, he said with a demented glint in his yellow eyes. And just why would that be your Orochi team? Are you going to molest me again like you did in the forest? The half-devil asked, off to the side. The red-haired Kunoichi powering the barrier snorted in laughter. Oh, Sarutobi asked as he looked down at his ward. You never told me about that, Naruto-kun. Naruto scratched the back of his head sheepishly. With all the excitement that was going on back then, I kind of forgot about it, G-san. But now, I think we should focus on your team of a student. Right, you are Naruto-kun, the aged leader replied as he discarded his robes to reveal the battle armor he wore underneath. He then bit his finger and performed a couple hand seals before slapping his hand on the roof and shouting, Kuchiyos no Jutsu. A cloud of smoke dissipated to revealing an old monkey wearing an outfit similar to the Hokage's. He looked around until his eyes settled on Orochimaru as he said, I see we're going to take on your student once more, Sarutobi. I still say you should have killed him all those years ago. Unfortunately, Inma, we cannot change what we have already done. But now, I will take down my student, even if it results in my death, the Sandaime said. Naruto placed a hand on his surrogate grandfather's shoulder. I hope it doesn't come to that, G-san. Inma looked back at Naruto and eyed him for a second before he bowed his head slightly. Greetings, descendant of Sparta. It is an honor to meet one of his bloodline in person. Now, then, shall we proceed with kicking the snake's ass? The question was met with smirks from the two Konohanins as the monkey boss transformed into a huge bow staff, which Sarutobi twirled expertly around himself. Orochimaru summoned his Kusanagi sword from the bowels of wherever it came from, I don't want to think about it, shudder, and held it in front of him in a ready stance. Well, sensei, time to show you how much I've grown, he said with an evil smirk. Naruto smirked ferally as he lifted his own sword from his back. It's hard to grow when you don't have anything to begin with, Orochi team. I'm sure what few women you might have been with decided to become lesbians after seeing how small you are. The same redhead from earlier nearly broke down laughing at this point. Orochimaru only snarled at the silver-haired genin as he charged. Lee breathed out slightly as he dispatched another Odonin. Faintly, he could hear the sounds of his sensei shouting out various challenges he would attempt if he didn't defeat a certain number of enemy shinobi. He turned to look at his female teammate over his shoulder and was amazed at how fluid and graceful her movements were as she fought with her many weapons. The black-haired boy watched her take down her foe and detachedly noticed the small blush on her cheeks while his eyes were temporarily drawn to her heaving chest before he forced them back up to the girl's eyes. Rock Lee knew that he was head over heels, absolutely smitten with, and had completely fallen in love with his bun-haired teammate. However, The only time he had admitted this simple fact was during one of his many conversations with a picture he had of his father, said man having been deceased ever since Lee had first entered the Shinobi Academy years ago. His chasing after Haruno Sakura was simply a ruse to make it seem like he didn't feel that way for Tenten, since Lee knew that the brown-haired girl was infatuated with their third teammate Niji. Because he was so deep within his thoughts, he didn't notice a shinobi lunge at him with a sword that was glowing blue with chakra until he heard Tenten yell, "Lee." The black-haired boy jerked his head up and saw that the man was too close. So he threw his cast-covered arm forward to meet the blade and was blinded by a flash of light. Up in the stands, both Anko and Hinata watched as, there, Naruto took on Sabaka no Gaara. The both of them were awestruck when Naruto summoned up the tornado of fire to halt Gaara's sand in its tracks. The two kunoichi were surprised at how well the silver-haired teen handled his sword, though Anko wondered how good he was with his other sword. They both knew that he had only just begun using it, and yet it seemed like he immediately became a master of swordsmanship. The awe faded away as they both began cheering for Naruto, Anko a little more enthusiastically than Hinata. Their cheering died down when Gaara revealed his Shikako form and Naruto proceeded to take the fight out of the arena. Hinata looked over at the snake mistress with a concerned frown. "Do you think Naruto-kun's going to be okay, Anko-san?" Anko just nodded her head confidently. Naruto-kun just doesn't have it in him to give up or give anything less than his all. He'll definitely be okay. She then looked down at the lavender-eyed girl. Just one thing, though. If the two of us are going to be going out with Naruto-kun, then there's no reason we can't be friends. So just call me Anko-chan or Hibi-chan. I can't stand formalities. Hinata nodded before she gasped in surprise when she saw the blue flames begin to spread across the Shikaku. Her and Anko watched in silence as Gamabunta broke apart the now-glass tanuki and both cheered loudly, well, as loud as Hinata can get, when Naruto entered the arena carrying Gaara on his shoulder. Then, the invasion started. Some idiotic Chunin thought he'd get lucky and tried to attack Anko from behind, only to get a pair kunai lodged in his throat for his troubles. Anko stood up and threw another 2 pairs at some other poor shinobi. She then launched a snake from her sleeve at another attacker and had the serpent inject its venom into him. The snake mistress of Konoha looked down at the wide-eyed girl and smirked lightly. "Come on, Hinata-chan. There are plenty of invaders to use as target practice," she shouted with an arm thrust into the air. Hinata, meanwhile, was feeling the familiar feelings of self-doubt and insecurity instilled by years of faulty training under her father. Questions rampaged through her head, ranging from, what if I lose? What if someone I know gets hurt because I'm not strong enough? And finally, what would Naruto-kun do? That last one made her pause as she thought about her now silver-haired love interest. Just a couple hours ago, she had met Naruto at one of Konoha's training grounds when he was making his way to the arena for the 3rd part of the Chunin exams. He had confided in her that it was tough for him at times to keep getting up after failing at something, and that sometimes he had seriously thought about just giving up. She had vehemently, well, as vehemently as her shy self could, shot down that thought as she told him that she thought he was incredibly brave to keep on trying and never give up. She had called him a proud failure, someone who wasn't afraid to admit they had done something wrong and was willing to get back up and keep on trying until they got it right. She was torn from her thoughts when a shout from her left drew her attention. She looked up and saw a sound shinobi was almost on top of her. On instinct, she launched a palm strike at the nin's chest, her hand glowing bright blue from the chakra gathered. When her palm hit the man's chest right above the shinobi's heart, the nin spasmed and coughed up a glob of blood onto Hinata's jacket before he keeled over, his last breath leaving his body. Hinata was frozen at the sight of her first kill until she was startled out of her funk by the hand on her shoulder. She looked up and saw Anko's concerned face looking down at her. "You'll have plenty of time to think about your first kill later, Hinata. I promise that Kurinai-chan and I will sit down with you, and we will talk about it," she said with a kind smile. The smile turned to an evil smirk as she continued. "For now, we got to take care of these bastards who think they can take over our home." Hinata looked down at the dead shinobi before looking back up at the purple-haired woman and nodding with determined glint in her lavender eyes. She stood up and shed herself of her slightly blood-covered baggy jacket, revealing an extremely fit body clad in a dark blue tank top and short shorts with a pair of kunai/shuriken holsters located on her hips. Anko whistled lightly and said, "Why in the world do you hide your body, Hinata-chan? You'd have guys drooling over you left and right if you wore clothes that fitted your body better." She tossed a kunai over her shoulder and nailed a random Sunachunin in his eye. Cue screams of pain. Hot damn, this girl could give me a run for my money in a year or two. What the hell does she eat? Hinata blushed lightly and looked away from the older woman. There's only one person that I want drooling over me, Anko is Anko-chan. I just hope he finds me attractive enough. She suddenly ducked underneath a thrown kunai and spun around to the owner of the offending metal knife, throwing her own knives in retaliation. They hit their target accompanied by the sound of bloody squelches. Anko's response was taken from her by the blinding white light that erupted throughout the stadium. Once it died down, the two looked over where they guessed the light originated from and were surprised by what they saw. Lee felt the world slow down around him as he closed his eyes while the shinobi lunged closer, the nin's chakra-covered blade poised to pierce the black-haired boy's body. The black-eyed genin threw his cast-covered arm forward to intercept the blade. He thought that the blade would pierce straight through his arm and his life would be over. I wish I could have had the courage to tell Tin-chan my true feelings. If I somehow survive this, I swear that I will let her know. However, something else happened. The blade was stopped and the cast was shredded into tiny pieces as a completely new arm took its place, accompanied by a bright flash of white light. It looked like an arm-long, armored, fingerless glove that had an opening in the middle of the back of the hand, thin veins running along it, and it was palmless. The veins, palm, and the opening on the back of the hand glowed with an eerie green light that pulsed every now and then, while the rest of it was as black as the darkest night. A slash in. If you have trouble picturing it, think Nero's Devilbringer arm. Only black where it's red and green where it's blue. Lee also went through some other changes. His normally all-black eyes gained an eerie green iris that glowed similarly to his arm and no longer looked like a bug's eyes. His hair had changed to a silvery grayish color and now was spiked straight up like a forest of knives. A slash in, like Super Saiyan 2 Gohan, minus the pointy bang. Finally, he had a green bar coming from both of his eyes down his cheeks, similarly to a certain Toad Sannin. Lee snapped out of his observations and saw that his opponent was still staring at his unusual arm. The green-eyed genin decided to take advantage of his opponent's distraction and, with his normal arm, pulled the now-normal sword out of the way. He then lashed out with his demonic arm and uppercut the nin straight through the roof of the arena stands. Lee looked down at his arm in surprise before looking up at the hole caused by the shinobi. "This thing sure can pack a punch," he softly said. H looked up and saw his bun-haired teammate staring at his left arm apprehensively. "Not to worry, Tin-chan. I think this might be something similar to what Naruto-kun recently exhibited in his match. After this invasion is over with, I shall seek him out and inquire as to what this might mean," he stated before a smile spread across his lips and he pumped his demonic arm into the air. "In the meantime, I shall use my new arm to help my flames of youth burn brighter than ever before." Tintin smiled lightly in relief as Lee moved on to his next foe. It seemed that despite having a new, and she quietly admitted in her mind, appealing appearance and bizarre arm, he was still the same old Rock Lee. As she went back to fighting more of the invading shinobi, Tintin allowed her mind to mostly detach itself from the battle, only keeping enough awareness to fight off her enemies, one of the many useful tricks taught by Guy-sensei, and pondered the odd situation she found herself in with her two male teammates. Back when they had been in the academy, Tintin had been right alongside most of the girls in thinking that their Rookie of the Year, Hyuga was Kami-sama's gift to women. Back then, she had thought him to be the epitome of what a shinobi should be. Thankfully, she had managed to keep herself from becoming a fangirl and developed her mastery with throwing any kind of weapon. The brown-haired girl had also thought that the dead last of their class, Rock Lee, had been kind of cute and had admired his desire to become a shinobi without the use of nin or the jinjutsu. Of course, Most of the thoughts of him being cute had faded away after they became Jinin under Mado Guy. When Lee had been introduced to green spandex, although the clothing did sometimes show off his muscular physique, and she honestly didn't mind the spouts about the flames of youth, she could do without witnessing the man hugs, though. As time wore on, Tintin got to witness more and more the side of Niji he hadn't shown in the academy. Whenever he and Lee would spar, it became obvious after a couple weeks that Lee was holding back. At times he would move as if to grab something from his back before he seemed to realize that there was nothing there, while at other times he would nearly unclasp the weights he wore on his arms and legs before stopping himself. Niji either he never realized this, or he didn't care, because he would always insult Lee every time he would beat the black-eyed Genin. Even with all that, Tintin tried to hold out hope that Niji would get nicer. When he didn't, she sometimes wondered what the heck she had seen in him. The oddest thing, though, was when they had made their way to the first part of the Chunin exams, and Lee had, in his own way, hit on that pink-haired girl. What was her name again? She had felt jealous right then. As odd as it may sound, the bun-haired girl had wished it was her receiving Lee's attention. She had tried to forget about the feelings of jealousy by focusing on the exam. After the preliminaries that followed the second part of the exam, she had to wait a day before she was healed enough to go up and about. In that time, she had found out about what had happened in the rest of the matches from her sensei and went to go help Niji train for the finals. At the time, she had just thought that everyone was overstating what her teammate had done to his cousin, though her inner romantic side had been moved when she heard how Naruto had sworn on Hinata's fallen blood to beat Niji. It wasn't until her other teammate had woken up that she learned how wrong she was. When she had gone in to see Lee, she told him what she had been doing since the preliminaries and was surprised when Lee did something she never thought he'd do. He actually let loose a couple swear words directed at Niji. Tintin was stunned into silence by Lee's narrative of what had happened. She had gone home and cried after the black-eyed boy had finished his tale by swearing that what he told was the absolute truth, on penalty of giving up his flames of youth. She knew he was telling the truth, not because of him potentially giving up a part of his self, but because of the look in his black eyes as he stared into her chocolate brown ones. He's always been extremely serious when the flames of youth get involved, she thought with a small smile as she drew a kunai across her crippled opponent's neck. She glanced over at Lee and saw him utilizing his demonic arm as a shield to block attacks, and then attacking either with that arm or his pilfered katana. Her eyes widened slightly when she realized that for a mainly taijutsu user, he was skilled with his sword. And not just the kind of skill you gain after a week or a month, but the kind you gain from training with a sword your whole life. She also noticed that from time to time, whenever he was attacking with a katana, he would try to twist the hilt like it was a movable part. Suddenly, cheers erupted from around the stadium. Lee and Tintin looked around in confusion before they walked over to Anko and Hinata, who had fought their way through their own horde of Odo and Sunanines and were now hugging each other while cheering. "Hey, do you girls know what's going on?" Tintin asked the two over the roar of the cheering. Hinata, who had tears of relief leaking from her lavender eyes, pointed at the roof of the Kage's box, which was now free of the purple box set up by the Sound 4. Standing there was a weary Sandaime Hokage and a slightly bloody Uzumaki Naruto. "Orochimaru has retreated," Sarutobi shouted. "Spread out and kill any Odonin while subduing all Sunanines who won't willingly surrender. It has been revealed that the Yondaime Kazekage was killed by Orochimaru and the shinobi of Suna were tricked into participating in the invasion. Pass on what you've just been told to the rest of our forces. Now go." All Chunin and Jounin Konoha shinobi, minus Anko, shoe-shined out of the arena while the genin scattered in the crowd began checking over the civilians. The Sandaime then turned towards the silver-haired genin and whispered something in his ear. Naruto nodded and vanished from the Sandaime's side in a burst of speed. He reappeared before the group of four and was immediately glomped by Hinata and Anko. "Gah!" With that shout from the half-devil, the threesome toppled over. The two glompers started giggling. Well, Anko outright laughed, and Naruto's predicament while Tintin and Lee looked on in confusion. Eventually, Naruto was able to get the two incredibly beautiful kunoichi to let him up off the floor. Once he was standing and had reassured Anko and Hinata that he was all right and that the cuts had already healed, He turned to Lee with an extremely serious look. "Lee, we need to meet the Hokage in his office ASAP," he said while pointing his thumb over his shoulder. Lee's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "What for Naruto-kun? Should I not head back to the hospital?" Naruto shook his head. "It's about your arm, Lee. I can tell you what it is and where it came from. However, it's not something to discuss out here in the open. And besides, do you really want to go back to the hospital?" Lee sighed in resignation. "No, I do not, and they never let me train in there. My flames of youth dampen each time I must stay there for long periods of time." He turned to his bun-haired teammate. "I guess I'll see you in a little while, Ten-chan. Can you head to our training ground in about an hour or so? There's something important I wish to tell you." "Sure thing, Lee. I'll go see if I can find Guy-sensei until then," Tintin said with a short nod. Anko and Hinata, meanwhile, were just one step short of super freak-out worry mode when they finally noticed the very fresh scar on Naruto's stomach. They fired questions at him until he promised to give them the full play-by-play after he had finished speaking with the Sandaime. The two kunoichi calmed down and noticed that Naruto's posture seemed lighter, like he had a huge weight lifted off his shoulders. When they asked him if he was okay, he simply told them that a question that he had been wondering about for a long time had finally been answered, and that he would tell them all about it as part of the play-by-play he had promised. When he noticed that Tintin and Lee had finished their goodbyes, the blue-eyed genin said, "All right then, Lee, let's go see the Hokage." They took off running, leaving behind the three kunoichi. As they made their way to the Hokage Tower, taking down some of the straggling Odonins, Lee noticed that ever since his arm had transformed, he had been sending less and less of the chakra gained from opening the first gate down to his cast-covered leg, so that he wouldn't be hindered by it. He could still feel that there was something wrong with his leg, but it didn't hurt as much now as it did before. Soon, the two genin arrived at the Hokage Tower and quickly proceeded up the stairs that wound their way around the building. When they arrived at the level of the Hokage's office, the Sandaime's secretary quickly escorted them into the office, where the aged leader was sitting behind his desk with an empty pipe hanging from his mouth. Once the two genin had entered the room, the Hokage sped through a series of hand seals and soundproofed the room, followed by drawing the curtains on his windows. Before the curtains had fully closed, though, the two teens were able to see that a tiny section of Konoha's wall had been demolished. Sarutobi Hiruzen sat back down in his chair and removed his battle helm before placing it on his desk. He leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Phew, these old bones can't move like they used to. Oh, to be young and spry again." After a moment of reminiscence, he shook his head to clear the cobwebs. "But enough of my lamentations. I believe I called you two here to discuss what recently occurred at the arena, correct?" Both of the boys nodded their heads. "Very well then. Naruto-kun, why don't you start, since I'm sure you have the most knowledge on this subject?" Naruto nodded and turned to Lee. "Before I can do that, though, you need to know something, Lee. 14 years ago, when the Kyuubi no Kitsune attacked Konoha, the Yondaime wasn't able to kill the Nine Tails. Instead, he sealed the Kyuubi within his only son, me." Lee's eyes widened comically as he asked, "You're the son of the Yondaime Hokage?" Naruto started to nod before he stopped and asked, "Wait, you don't care that the Kyuubi is sealed inside of me? I have a teammate who seals dozens of sharp and pointy weapons into scrolls. That doesn't suddenly mean that the scrolls become pointy, although they can still be used as weapons," he admitted with a sheepish smile. "Believe me, she has used her scrolls as clubs at times. So, just because you're the scroll for the Kyuubi doesn't mean you are the nine-tailed fox." Naruto genuinely smiled and said, "Thanks, Lee. That really means a lot. Now then, I suppose you want to know what happened to your arm, huh?" When Lee nodded, the silver-haired half-devil disclosed all the information he had learned from the Kyuubi about their heritage and abilities. After Naruto had finished, Lee looked down at his Devilbringer, which he learned was the proper name for his new arm, and said, "So now, I'm a half-devil." Naruto laid a hand on the green-eyed boy's shoulder and said, "Yes, but you are still you. Being a half-devil won't change who you are. To change is your choice." The Sandaime nodded, while said Naruto-kun. Now, on to other matters. The two genin turned back to their leader, who was about to continue speaking when a knocking at the door interrupted him. Komein, an Umbu wearing a black cloak and dragon-styled mask entered the room and kneeled before the Sandaime. Lord Hokage, all the Odo shinobi that were unable to escape have been eliminated, and the Suna shinobi are heading back to their home village. The late Kazakage's youngest son has informed me that he will be speaking to their village's council in order to begin planning a new treaty between us. Also, the civilians are being escorted back to their homes, with only a small amount having their properties damaged. Finally, the prisoner was secured as you requested. A guard has been posted, and only those you yourself authorize with the discuss code will be allowed to enter. Hiruzen nodded and gestured for the Umbu to rise as he said, "Very good, Captain. I'll expect a full report to be handed in soon. Dismissed, and find Jiraiya. Tell him to come to my office immediately." The Umbu nodded and was just about to leave when a voice said, "No need, Sensei. I'm already here." A section of the wall shimmered before revealing the white-haired Sannin standing there with his arms crossed over his broad chest and a thoughtful frown on his face. "So you are Jiraiya. Very well, go prepare that report, Captain," the Sandame said to the Umbu. The Umbu bowed and left the office. The aged leader turned back to the two genin. "Now then, as I was about to say before we were interrupted, I have managed to compile all the reports from the proctors, and I have decided on which of the genin are to be promoted." He looked both of the eager genin in their eyes and continued, "I'm sorry to say, Lee, that at the moment you do not show the necessary qualities to be a chunin. That's not to say your skills are lacking, only your mindset. You risked your career as a shinobi, and more importantly your life, to take down a single enemy. In a real conflict, that kind of action is very rash and shows that you do not look beyond that single opponent. A chunin should be able to see beyond just the person they are fighting and be ready to aid their comrades. That second quality you did show you possess when you aided Team 7 in the second part of the exam. Maybe you can prove yourself at the next chunin exams, or if this conflict with Odo progresses to war, you could get promoted due to your actions on the battlefield. Keep that in mind." The Sandame turned to Naruto and began speaking. "Naruto, ever since the exams began, you have proven again and again that you are Konoha's #1 unpredictable shinobi. In the first part of the exam, you didn't answer a single question on your sheet, yet you were willing to risk not getting promoted in order to move ahead. Not to mention your little speech that managed to give the remaining genin in that exam the will to move on as well. In the second part, after we had reviewed the security tapes, once the preliminaries were over, we discovered that you took down a large snake summon by yourself. You then went on to protect your teammates by jumping in front of another snake summon. Unfortunately, Orochimaru managed to place that seal on you that your own sensei," Naruto scoffed at that word, "didn't notice was affecting you. Despite this, you defeated your opponent in the preliminary and went on to defeat your opponent in the third part of the exam as well. You then took down a physical manifestation of the Ichibi and aided me in the fight against my former student, wounding him greatly in the process." He stood up and unrolled a scroll on his desk before palming one of the seals while channeling his chakra into it. After the customary cloud of smoke had dispersed, a chunin vest was revealed lying on the desk. The Hokage picked it up and presented it to a stunned Naruto. "Congratulations, Uzumaki Naruto, chunin of Konohagakure," the Sandame stated. Naruto slowly accepted the vest as Hiruzen continued speaking. "May you wear it with pride and continue to uphold the will of fire." Naruto took off his jacket, which was now missing its 3 tails, along with Kitsune, and put on the vest before replacing his jacket and sword. "Arigato Hokage-sama," he said before shuddering. "Man, it feels weird actually being respectful to you." Everyone gathered laughed at that. The Toad Sannin came up and clapped a hand on Naruto's shoulder as he said, "Congrats, Gaki. One step closer to your dream, huh?" Naruto nodded, "Yup. Oh, I got a message for you, Arrow Sennin." Without warning, he spun and launched a foot up into the spot between Jiraiya's legs. "That's for using my Ka sand in one of your books. Tusen wanted you to know that she's waiting for you in heaven so she can kick your perverted butt, among other bits of you." The Sannin just gurgled and slumped to the floor. The Hokage looked down at the gurgling Sannin before shifting his gaze up to the new Chunin and asked, "How did you know that your mom was used in his books, Naruto?" "Simple. I made a bet with Arrow Sennin here that I could come with a better way for him to conduct his research when we started our training after I got dumped on Ebisu Sensei. If I had lost, I would have had to reveal what I was doing and take the punishment without running away. I won, though, and got a copy of each of Ero Sennin's books, Naruto explained. It wasn't until I had that quick discussion with Tu-san about Ka-san that I realized who one of the main characters in the third volume was. Tu-san already knew, and that's why he wanted me to kick Ero Sennin in his nuts. Lee, who had been looking on in confusion, asked, "What books are you talking about?" "The Ika series," Naruto replied. "Definitely good books." "Hey Lee," he quickly continued before questions could be asked. He handed the genin a slip of paper and said, "Come to this address after you finish your business with Tenten. It's where my father's house is located, and it's supposed to have some cool stuff stored away in it." Lee nodded and took the slip of paper as he said, "Sure thing, Naruto-kun. After I meet up with Tenchan, I shall meet you at your father's house." As he turned to leave, Naruto asked, "You love her, don't you?" Lee froze mid-step and asked, "What makes you think that, Naruto-kun?" "I know what it's like to like a girl and be afraid she won't like you back," he said and laid a hand on Lee's shoulder. "Don't be too scared and never tell her. It will hurt more if you lose her and you never tell her how you feel. Trust me on that, Lee, because believe me when I say that it hurts a whole lot." Lee nodded slowly. "I was already planning on revealing my feelings to my teammate Naruto-kun, but now after hearing your words, I am certain of my course of action. I won't be afraid anymore. I will tell Tenchan that I love her." The gray-haired genin turned to Naruto. "And perhaps later, I can hear your tale of lost love, Naruto-kun." Before Naruto could answer, the Sandaime interrupted. "Ahem. While I am pleased to see one of my genin find love, there is another reason I called you two here. Tomorrow, Jiraiya will be heading out to find my other wayward student, Tsunade. She is to be my successor and become the Godame Hokage." "Wait a second, Ji-san," said Naruto with a small frown. "Didn't you used to tell me she had gigantic temper, small amount of patience, and a vicious right hook?" Jiraiya, who had woken up from his pain-induced stupor when Lee had asked his question to Naruto about what he meant and had been writing down notes about that particular subject, snickered at the description. "That pretty much hits the nail on the head, except for two other things. She has an enormous set of tits and a nice butt." Sarutobi's sweat dropped while Naruto and Lee shivered slightly as their thoughts treaded towards dangerous zones. The aged leader mumbled. "Moving on, the reason I'm telling the two of you this is because you both will be going with Jiraiya on his search. Take the rest of the day to relax and meet Jiraiya at the West Gate tomorrow morning." The two teens bowed to the Hokage and exited the office. After a minute of silence, Jiraiya slapped his forehead and exclaimed, "Ah, I forgot to ask Naruto which volume was his favorite." Meanwhile, with Anko and Hinata, after the invasion had ended and things calmed down, Anko dragged the blue-haired genin off to a clothing store. Poor Hinata had nearly had her arm wrenched out of her socket due to the force of the elder Kunoichi's pulling. When they had arrived at the store, Hinata had asked why they had come here, to which Anko replied with, "If you're going to be my friend Hinata-chan, then you're going to have to wear something different. I won't be associated with someone who hides their incredible figure." She finished with a smile to take away the seriousness of the statement before entering the store. It was to this that Naruto entered the store just as Anko was shouting at clothing stall, "I got a good feeling about this outfit, Hinata-chan. You're going to knock Naruto-kun's socks off with it. Should I be worried?" Naruto asked with a grin. Anko spun to him with a small smile. "Naruto-kun." She rushed over to him and wrapped him in a hug, which he returned. The purple-haired woman pulled back and said, "The only thing you should be worried about is passing out from a nosebleed. Hinata-chan has looked very sexy in some of these outfits I've picked." Naruto nodded as he stared over Anko's shoulder. "I can see that," he muttered as a small nosebleed began. Anko turned around, and her jaw dropped at the sight before the two of them. Hinata stood there garbed in clothing that definitely emphasized the fact that she would definitely grow up to be a beautiful woman. She was wearing a shiny black tube top with dark chest wraps underneath that brought attention to her well-developed breasts, and over that was a white jacket that had an yin-yang symbol on the back and Hinata's personal flames in a circle symbol on her shoulders. She had on slightly loose-fitting pants that were held halfway up her hips by a thick white belt and had zippers at her knees to allow a quick change to shorts. They could see the side straps of a black thong reaching up to be level with her belly button. On her feet was a pair of tabi that had shin guards attached. The most surprising part was tattoo on her toned stomach of a bleeding violet. Enko gave her a thumbs up. All right, now you're looking hot, girl. What do you think, Naru? She paused when she noticed that Naruto seemed to be in a trance. Enko grinned at the younger girl and said, I think you broke him. Naruto snapped out his funk and said, um, you look beautiful, Hinata-chan. The blue-haired girl blushed rosily at his compliment. Enko snorted. Try smoking hot, and you'll get closer to the mark, Naruto-kun. Please, Enko-chan. I'm not what you said I am. Hinata objected while looking down slightly. I'm just me. Naruto walked forward and wrapped her in a gentle hug. No, she's right, Hinata-chan. I think you look incredible in this outfit. It definitely suits you better than your baggy jacket. Now come on, I believe I owe you two a story. He grabbed Hinata's hand and began leading her out of the store. Enko stayed behind for a minute and looked around at the rack of clothes, then down at herself as she muttered, maybe I should change my outfit too. With one last glance at the racks of clothing, she followed the two teens out of the store after making sure to pay for the clothes. In one of the many training grounds that littered Kanahagakure, Rock Lee paced back and forth as he mumbled to himself. A new addition to his appearance was a unique-looking sword on his back. It looked like you could cut stuff with only one edge of the blade while the other side looked wider than usual. The handle was divided into two sections by a gray circle with a small thin bar coming down for where the blade and handle met to serve as a guard for the wielder's hand, /in. I know that's not a good description. So for those of you who haven't played Devil May Cry 4, go Google Red Queen. The reason the gray-haired genin was pacing and muttering was because he was trying to figure out how to tell his female teammate he loved her. He had been pacing ever since he had arrived at the training ground after fetching the sword that had been passed down from parent to child in his family for many, many generations. The sword would definitely serve as a good icebreaker for his weapon-loving teammate. The gray-haired boy sat down on a log that served as a bench and rested his head in his hands. This could quite possibly be the hardest thing I've ever done. He pulled his sword, which his father had told him had been known as Red Queen ever since it had been forged, off his back and whispered quietly to it. Honored ancestors, please give me strength. I thought I was supposed to be the one who talked to Weapons Lee, Tintin amusedly stated as she walked up, her hair in its rare state of not being in her traditional buns, and sat next to him on the log bench. She gestured for Lee to pass her the sword and reverently held it in her hands as she looked it over. It's heavier than most swords, and the single edge limits your options when attacking. Why is the hilt separated like this? She asked while indicating the band to split the hilt in two parts. Lee held out his human hand to take the sword back and stood up as he said, "It'll be easier if I show you Ten-chan." He hefted the sword onto his shoulder and walked a short distance away before settling into a ready stance. The gray-haired genin went through one of the more complex katas he knew before he launched himself into the air while revving the hilt of Red Queen, bringing forth a thunderous roar as the sword began glowing bright red. He then came falling back to the ground while stabbing his sword straight down. When he connected with the ground, a small circle of flames spread out from his sword struck the formerly grass-covered earth. Lee stumbled a bit as a small amount of pain surged up his cast-covered leg before he straightened up and turned back to his female teammate. That is why the hilt is separated. The first owner of this sword, an ancestor of mine who was called Nero, had Red Queen specially designed so that whenever he revved the hilt, the blade would heat up to the point that whenever it came into contact with something, it would let loose a small burst of flame. The half-devil explained with a small smile. "That's incredible, Lee," Tintin exclaimed while the gray-haired boy sat back down. "I don't think there's any other sword like that in all the elemental nations. I guess this is what you kept reaching for in those spars you had with Niji, huh?" Lee, mentally wincing at the reference to their other teammate, nodded before he cleared his throat. Tintin, when Naruto-kun and I went to the Hokage's office, I found out that he and I shall be going on a very important mission tomorrow. We're to go with Jiraiya-sama of the Sannin and locate Hokage-sama's other student, Tsunade. Seeing his teammates' mounting excitement, he finished with his own smile. "She's to come back with us and become the Go Dame Hokage." Tintin leapt from her seat and started cheering. Yes. 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 Finally, Kunoichi and Konoha can hold their heads high. This proves that women aren't inferior to men. Lee stood up and said, "If it means anything to you, Tin-chan, I have never thought you were inferior at all. Frankly, I don't know anyone who can match your skill with weapons. Anyone who thinks that just because you're a girl means you're weaker than them is in for a world of hurt." The brown-haired girl turned to her teammate and gently smiled at him. "Thanks, Lee. I can't believe that you're going to actually get to meet the legendary Tsunade." Lee placed his sword on his back, the special properties of the blade ensuring that it didn't fall, and shuffled his feet nervously. "Tin-chan, there's something I need to tell you. In case I don't make it back, I just want you to know that ever since our team was formed, I was always awed and dumbstruck by your grace and fluidity when you fought with your weapons. As time passed, that feeling grew greater and greater until..." He looked into her chocolate brown eyes and finished, "I fell in love with you, Tin-chan. And that feeling has only grown larger with each moment we spent with each other." Tinnen's mouth hung open slightly as she tried to respond. "I don't know what, I mean, it's just..." She stopped trying to speak in fear of saying something that might hurt Lee's feelings. Lee smiled and gently laid his human hand on her shoulder. "It's all right, Tin-chan. I just wanted to let you know how I felt. Earlier, when that shinobi was lunging at me with his sword, I thought that my life was over, and my only thought was that I had never told you that I love you. You don't need to suddenly feel the same way about me. I'll be glad if we can still be friends." Tintin was silent in thought for a moment before she nodded. "Don't worry, Lee will always be friends, for better or worse." "Oh, I almost forgot. Did you manage to find out anything about your new arm?" Lee nodded and led her back to the log bench. "I did, Tin-chan. According to Naruto-kun, it all started millennia ago with a devil named Sparta." Meanwhile, Naruto led Hinata and Anko to the apartment where he lived. Along the way, he was given the story of how Hinata got her violet tattoo. Apparently, after Team 8 had finished their Genin exam, Anko and Kurenai had dragged Hinata to the closest private tattoo parlor to get a tattoo. Anko explained that it was a tradition for the females of Team 8 to get a tattoo, one that had gone back to Anko's and Kurenai's. Both of the women were on the same Team 8, Sensei's Genin team. Anko even hiked up her mini skirt slightly, coming dangerously close to showing Naruto if she even wore panties. To reveal the tattoo she had of a snake circling around her left thigh. Anko told the two teens that Kurenai had an onyx raven in flight across her upper back, as well as a crimson rose on her right butt cheek. Naruto was left blushing for a bit at the image that provided. They arrived shortly after the story at Naruto's apartment, where he brought the two Kunoichi out to the living room and guided them to his faded couch. The silver-haired Chunin leaned his sword against the wall and sat down in a wooden chair across from his guests. "I guess now would be a good time to fill you in on what happened against the Orochi team. But first, some good news." He slid off his jacket so that the other two could see his brand new Chunin vest. "Ji-san promoted me to Chunin, and it turns out that Rock Lee is my distant cousin." "That's great, Naruto-kun." The two females chorused before Anko went on by herself. "Now you'll be able to go on harder missions and get more pay." Hinata nodded her concurrence before she asked, "But how is Lee-san your cousin?" Naruto rubbed the back of his head before he said, "If you really want to understand, I'm going to have to give you some background information on myself and Lee. You see, Lee and I are descended from this devil, and devils are pretty much just very powerful demons, who was known as Sparta. He rebelled against the rest of the demons and devils by sealing the human world off from the demon one, along with his demonic powers in the process. He then settled down with a wife and had 2 kids. Their names were Dante and Virgil. A couple years later, while he was traveling somewhere, he had another kid who was known as Nero. Dante and Nero went on to defend humans from various demons and devils, while Virgil attempted to gain the demonic power of their father by any means necessary. Lee is descended from Nero, and I am descended from Dante, which means that Lee and I are half devil and half human." Silence permeated the small room when Naruto, his head bowed, finished his explanation. "Nothing has changed about my feelings for you, Naruto-kun," Hinata softly said. Naruto looked up at her as she continued. "I wouldn't care if you were a full devil or just plain human. You are you, And that isn't going to change just because you've told us of your lineage. She's right, Naruto-kun. Anko piped in. The blue-eyed Chunin's gaze shifted her. The only change I can see right now is physical, and I have to say I'm enjoying the view, she said with a small smirk. Naruto chuckled as he wiped away a small tear before he gratefully smiled at them. Thank you. You have no idea how much that means to me, but I have to ask, are you not bothered by my devil trigger form? Anko tapped her chin in thought and asked, is that what you turned into down in the arena during your fight with Hinata-chan's team of a cousin? Naruto nodded. Do you think you could show us? Before we could only see it from a distance, I would like to see it up close. What do you think, Hinata-chan? The lavender-eyed girl nodded in agreement. Naruto nodded in return before he stood up and closed his eyes. In a flash of red light, he stood there in his fox-like devil trigger form. His eyes opened to reveal fiery red orbs surrounded by a sea of black. The black-furred Naruto removed his helmet and held it tucked under one arm. What do you think? He asked. The other two shivered lightly at the tingle that ran down their spines as they stood up and approached Naruto. They walked up to him and both kissed one of his cheeks, sending the skin underneath the fur blushing. Does that answer your question? The two kunoichi asked in unison. Naruto disengaged his devil trigger, a small blush decorating his cheeks. It does. But I think we got sidetracked from the reason I brought you two here. I believe I owe you a play-by-play of what happened against old Snakeface. Both girls nodded, and all three got settled in their seats. Hold in your interruptions and questions till the end, please. Once both the girls had nodded, Naruto began his tale. All right then. After Jisan had summoned the boss monkey and a little witty banter, Orochi team charged at us. Flashback start. Naruto's blade met Orochimaru's with a resounding clang. They strained against each other for a moment before the snake Sennin was forced to jump back by an overhead strike from Hiruzen. Naruto pressed forward and met the white-skinned man with a surprisingly agile attack, while Sarutobi attacked around Naruto, since he was more experienced and could anticipate his former student style of fighting. Orochimaru leapt back and stabbed his sword into the ground before going into a flurry of hand seals. Doton, Iwahibi no Jutsu. A snake-like pile of earth rose up from the roof and lunged at the two Konohanins. Naruto quickly summoned a Kagebushin that drew its own sword before both of their blades became covered in blue flames. Naruto and his clones swung their blades at the stone snake and launched a pair of blue crescents in the shape of an X at the snake. The blue flames made quick work of the stone reptile and collided with the purple shield with an echoing crash. A flash of white came from the stands, making the three combatants pause as they looked towards the source. Naruto smirked lightly when he saw the new Lee, while Sarutobi was stunned to the fact that there might possibly be another descendant of Sparta, and Orochimaru schemed on how to get both Naruto and this new descendant. The Hokage was the first to return his attention to the fight, and quickly sped through his own series of hand seals before bringing a hand up to his mouth as he mentally said, Katan, Kiryu no Jutsu. A large dragon's head made of fire sped from his mouth towards his one-time student. Naruto's jacket happened to be a little too close to the flames that sped past him and lit the tails on fire. The silver-haired genin quickly cut off the tails of his jacket and watched as Orochimaru nimbly dodged out of the way of the fire dragon. It seems you still have some fight in you, old man, Orochimaru stated conversationally. I guess it's time I reveal the ace up my sleeve. With that, he launched into a complex series of hand seals and bit his thumbs before he slammed both of his hands onto the roof with a shout of Kuchiyos no Jutsu. Edo Tensai. A purple seal inside of a circle appeared on the roof in front of Orochimaru. Naruto and the Sandaime felt an evil aura coming from the circle. A coffin that bore the kanji for show rose up, followed by one that bore the kanji of an eye. When a third coffin that had the kanji on it rose up, Sarutobi began forming some hand seals to prevent it from fully rising before he fell a hand on his shoulder. A quick glance revealed that the hand belonged to his surrogate grandson. Have faith, Ji-san, Naruto said and took his hand from Sarutobi's shoulder while staring at the third coffin. After a couple silent seconds, the coffins fully rose from the ground and their covers popped off. Three men stepped out. Senju Hashirama, Senju Tobamaru, and Namikaze Minato. The first, second, and fourth Hokages had been raised from the realm of the dead. The three men stepped out of their coffins, which collapsed back into the purple circle that faded from sight, and looked around at their surroundings. "Hello there, so. You sure have gotten old," Hashirama said when his gaze fell upon his one-time student. The Night-Aim looked back at Orochimaru as he vehemently said, "Then I suppose this fool has summoned us from the afterlife to fight you." "Hashirama-sensei, Tobamaru-sensei, it's hard to believe you're standing here," a chalked-up Sandaime said as he tearfully gazed at his predecessors. Meanwhile, another conversation was going on between Naruto and his father. "Hello, son," Minato said as he smiled at Naruto. "Your mother says hi, and we want you to know that she and I are both very proud of everything you've done." Naruto was silent for a moment as he stared at the man before him. "For a long time I always wondered who parents were, and now," he said quietly as he shook his head, "it's hard for me to believe that you're actually my father." "Well, believe it, son," the blonde-haired man said. "Oh, and the next time you see Ero-sensei, give him a good kick in his balls." "What for?" Naruto asked with a small frown. "The woman he used in the third volume, the red-haired one, was your mom. She also wants you to tell him that she's waiting to kick his ass as well as the rest of him when he passes on," Minato said with a chuckle. "As touching as these reunions are, I'm afraid we must move on," Orochimaru hissed as he walked up behind the first two Hokages. He placed a small piece of paper at their necks, which sank into their bodies. The Shodaime and Night-Aim suddenly straightened up as their muscles strengthened. When the white-skinned man went to place another paper tag on Minato, he was stopped by an iron-strong grip on his wrist. "You didn't really think I'd let you turn me into one of your little slaves, now did you?" Minato asked as he turned around with a fierce grin on his face. He then launched a lightning-fast kick at Orochimaru that sent the black-haired man flying backwards. The Yondaime popped his knuckles as he said, "Kami-sama granted me the use of my body for a short while when he found out what you were doing. Unfortunately, the other two Hokages were too far out of his power for him to grant them the same gift. Now then, who wants to kick that snake's ass? Right beside you two, Sin," Naruto said as he walked up in his devil trigger form, his Zweihander resting on his shoulder. Sarutobi walked up on the other side of the Yondaime with his battle staff at the ready. "It's time you answered for you crimes, Orochimaru." Minato glanced over at Sarutobi and asked, "Do you think you can hold off your idiot student while Naruto and I take care of the Kages? Can you take care of them?" Sarutobi asked back. Minato gave him a short nod. "Yep, we just have to remove the tags that Orochimaru put in them. Which means we have to cut their heads off Naruto," he added to his son. "Gotcha. So which one do you want? Sho or an eye?" Naruto asked as he adjusted his hold on his sword. "I'll take the Shodaime." "You get the Night-Aim," Minato shortly said. Naruto said nothing in reply as he switched Kitsune for Tanuki, his devil trigger form changing as well. His fox head changed to a Tanuki one with a large wicker hat, which had small hole for his Tanuki ears, replacing the helmet. His jacket disappeared as a necklace of monk prayer beads appeared around his neck. Naruto's skin turned tan and would feel like sand if someone were to touch it, with bright blue tribal lines appearing on his skin. His shirtless state, which exposed his hardened muscles, was instilling some R-rated thoughts in the mind of the redhead powering the barrier. Rounded shoulder pauldrons that looked similar to his shield, minus the 3 blades, also appeared. The half-devil's pants turned into monk-styled hakama that was as tan as his skin with similar blue lines appearing on it, as well, while his boots became steel-bottomed Geta sandals. "Enough of this," Orochimaru shouted as he brandished his Kusanagi. "All of you will die here." With that shout, the battle was joined once more. Minato engaged the Shodaime in a flurry of speed, making use of his Horatian kunais to flash around his opponent while leaving little gashes on the first body. Hashirama tried to keep up with the blonde-haired man, but could only see the flashes of yellow that surrounded him like a vortex. He tried to bring his hands together to form hand seals, but suddenly found them separated from his body, followed by his arms and his legs at the knees. Minato suddenly appeared in front of the dismembered Shodaime and, with a larger-than-normal kunai, decapitated the former fire shadow. The blonde Hokage fished out the paper tag from the first remains and tore in two. Minato sighed in relief and looked over to see how his son was doing. A few minutes earlier, Naruto raised a shield to block a water bullet that came rushing at his head. He responded by launching a tornado of sand at the second Hokage, who brought up a wall of water that turned the sand to mud. The blue-eyed teen sped forward and attempted to slice at the night aim with one of the blades on his shield. The gray-haired man nimbly dodged out of the way and drew out two kunai, which he threw at Naruto, who once more blocked with his shield. The half-devil jumped back as he threw his shield at impressive speed at the second fire shadow and managed to lob off one of the night aim's arms. Naruto caught the shield as it flew back towards him and was about to attack once more when he noticed a second Orochimaru sneaking up behind the Sandaime, who was battling either a clone or the real Orochimaru. Naruto quickly switched back to Kitsune and ran as fast as he could to his surrogate grandfather. Naruto managed to make it to the back of Sarutobi just as the second Orochimaru attempted to stab the Sandaime with his Kusanagi. The silver-haired teen gave a small shout as the blade stabbed straight through his stomach. The shout drew the attention of his father, who had taken advantage of the night aim's confused state and removed the tag powering him, and his surrogate grandfather, who had dispatched the clone he had been fighting. Before anybody could do anything, though, Naruto brought his Zweihander down on one of Orochimaru's arms, severing it clean from the white-skinned man's torso, and grabbed hold of the hilt of the Kusanagi. The blue-eyed teen yanked it out of his body and slashed upwards, severing Orochimaru's other arm. "Let's see you molest little boys now, Orochi team," Naruto shouted as he coughed up a little bit of blood while falling down to one knee, using the two swords to keep his body upright. The Odo kid stumbled backwards, blood spurting out in great gushes where his arms had once been attached to his body, and managed to choke out a shout of retreat. The Sound Four quickly lowered the barrier, and three of them caught their leader before he hit the roof. They then proceeded to make their getaway, shouting to their one member who hadn't managed to assist in the catching of Orochimaru, "Stall them." The red-haired Dia looked around at the gathered shinobi, which included the small group of Umbu that had been waiting outside the barrier, and said, "Fuck that." She tore off her Hittite that bore the musical note of the Sound Village and threw it down as she raised her arms. "I'm not risking my life for him. I never really liked those bastards anyway." The Sandaime motioned for the Umbu captain to come closer. "Captain, I want you to take her to the Umbu holding cells. Absolutely no one, aside from me or whoever I say directly to your face, along with showing you the code, 58 hand sign, is to get within 10 feet of her cell." The Umbu captain saluted and gathered his troops before they escorted Tayuya to the Umbu headquarters. Minato, meanwhile, walked over to his still panting son and bonked him on his head. "What the hell were you thinking?" Naruto, after shaking his head a bit, stood up and placed Kitsune on his back while still keeping a firm grip on the Kusanagi, the stab wound he received from the Sannin's blade already healing. Jisen doesn't have a healing factor like I do. Plus, I could feel what might have been a poison begin to spread through my body before mine, and QBE's healing power kicked in. Jisan would most likely be dead if I hadn't intercepted the blade. The blonde Hokage just shook his head. "You're so like your mother. I swear you get your reckless streak from her side of the family." He pulled out a small slip of paper and handed it to Naruto. "Anyways, take this. It's the address to my house. I think there's some stuff in there that you might like. Only one of my blood may open the door." Naruto looked up at his father and asked, "Why would you be carrying this in your pocket?" Minato scratched the back of his head and smiled sheepishly. "To be honest, I would sometimes forget where I live, especially after a long day filled with nothing but filling out paperwork." Suddenly, his body began to crumble into ash. "It looks like my time is up, son. Always remember that your mother and I loved you with all our hearts. Become a good man and an even greater Hokage someday. Goodbye, my son." With that, he was gone. Naruto put the piece of paper in one of his pockets and wiped a tear from his eye as he whispered, "Goodbye, Tusan." After a quick moment of silence, he pulled out a storage scroll and sealed the Kusanagi into it. Flashback end. Silence once again occupied the apartment for a couple minutes before Anko stood and did something neither of the younger teens expected. She swept Naruto up into a tight, spinning hug before she grabbed his whiskered face and began to passionately make out with the silver-haired half-devil. Naruto's eyes were close to falling out of their sockets, and before he could respond in any way, the sexy seductress pulled back with a coy smile on her lips. "Don't think that a kiss like that is going to be a common thing, Naruto-kun," Anko said before she ran a finger along one of Naruto's whisker marks, slowly rubbing her voluptuous body against Naruto's. "You're going to have to work for another kiss like that." Naruto shivered slightly at how seductive Anko was being. "Oh no, Naruto-kun," Hinata quietly asked, a little embarrassed, and turned on by what she just witnessed. The blue-eyed Chunin turned his attention towards the lavender-eyed girl who asked, "When you were talking to Yandame-sama, what did you mean when you said Kyubu?" Naruto visibly flinched and stuttered inanely for a moment before Anko lightly slapped his cheeks. The silver-haired teen smiled at her thankfully before he turned back to Hinata and sighed heavily, Anko having backed up a step or two. He was silent for a moment as he gathered his thoughts on what to say to the Hyuga heiress. "Hinata-chan, 14 years ago, the Kyubi no Kitsune was forced into attacking Konoha by a man named Madara Uchiha and a couple of his followers. When she arrived at Konoha, the shinobi and kunoichi tried to fight back, but were extremely unsuccessful until the Yandame arrived," Naruto said. "But he didn't kill Kyubi like all the history books said. The only way to defeat a tailed beast is to seal into something, and unfortunately, the gobi through the Kyubi can only be sealed into a human being, and the Kyubi can only be sealed into a newborn." By now, Hinata's pearl-like eyes had grown wide as the pieces began to assemble in her mind while Naruto continued speaking. "I probably wasn't the only newborn around the time, but I had one defining characteristic that the other newborns didn't. I was the son of the Yandame Hokage, and Tusen wasn't one to ask someone else to do something he wasn't willing to do himself. So he did what many would consider unthinkable. He sealed Kyubi Yui inside me. I am the Jinchuriki of the Kyubi no Kitsune." The half-devil fed when the Hyuga heiress crashed into him and wrapped him into a tight hug. Naruto, blushing slightly from the feeling of Hinata's well-developed torso pressing up against his, slowly returned the hug. "So, I guess you don't hate me for being a Jinchuriki, huh?" Naruto softly asked. Hinata giggled lightly and looked up at Naruto, her eyes shining slightly with unshed tears. "It would be kind of ridiculous of me to hate you for that after I already said that I didn't have a problem with you being a half-devil Naruto-kun," the lavender-eyed girl said with a small smile. As she stared into his sapphire eyes, Hinata's lips slowly moved closer to Naruto's before they gently began to caress the half-devils. The Hyuga heiress and son of the Yandame both closed their eyes as they gently kissed one another, Anko smiling softly on the sideline. They pulled apart, and, out of the corner of his eye, Naruto noticed the time. He picked up his jacket and sword as he said, "I'm sorry to cut this short, but it's time for me to meet up with Lee. You two can make yourselves at home if you want." He went to leave, but stopped as he snapped his fingers. "Oh, almost forgot. Tomorrow Lee and I are going to be heading out on a mission to find G-San's student, Tsunade. Apparently, she's going to be the next Hokage." Anko sighed theatrically and said, "Ah, now we have to wait even longer for our date." Naruto smiled and gave both of the girls a quick kiss. "Don't worry. When I get back, I'll make it up to both of you. I promise. And you know me, I dash. Never go back on your word." The two kunoichi finished for him and pecked his cheeks. Naruto smiled goofily and called as he strode out the door, "See you later, girls." As he made his way to the address given to him by his father, Naruto decided to enter his mindscape to see what was going on with the Kyubi and Ichibi. Naruto felt the world around him fall away and become replaced by a sewer with ankle-high water coating the floor. The silver-haired half-devil casually walked towards where he remembered the Kyubi's cage being. As he got closer, the newly appointed Chunin began to hear the sound of grunting, growling, and shouting. Soon, Naruto arrived at the cage, the mental representation of a Shikifuin, and found a sight that made clamp both of his hands over his nose to prevent the geyser that would have surely erupted. The reasons Naruto nearly suffered from a nosebleed that would have surely knocked him out were currently engaged in an activity on the other side of the bars. The red-haired, butt-naked Kyubi no Kitsune was currently putting the other figure behind the bars in a sleeper hold as she shouted, "Say it! Say it!" "Fine," the other person replied while struggling still. I am Mistress Kyubi-sama's bitch and her toy to use however she wants. The Kyubi just smirked and slapped the person's ass hard as she released her hold. That's right, bitch. She then noticed Naruto, who was trying to figure out whether more blood was rushing to his nose or his lower head, standing there and waved with a smile. Ah, Naruto-kun. Welcome. I'd like you to meet the Ichibi no Shikaku. She gestured at the gasping female on the floor as Naruto took a good look at her. The Ichibi's figure was definitely as stunningly sexy as Kyubi's, except for one key difference. Her breasts were humongous, easily a good 3 sizes larger than the red-haired vixen. Plus, instead of having fox ears and tail, she had tanuki ears and tail. She had sandy brown hair that came down to her shoulder and worn a tan skirt that hugged her hips while flaring out around her knees. However, she was currently topless and revealed her large breasts with hot pink nipples to the world. The Ichibi, still getting her breath back, just nodded at Naruto in greeting. The silver-haired teen nodded back as he tried, and failed, to keep his eyes diverted from her rising and falling breasts. So what was that about? Naruto finally managed to ask, nasally, since he still had his hands over his nose. The Kyubi just giggled, bringing Naruto's attention to her chest, and lightly said, "Oh, nothing really." Ichi-chan came in here, thinking that just because I'd been sealed within you meant I was weaker than the time when I was outside. So I decided to show Ichi-chan here just who's the alpha female. Ah, Naruto intelligently said, "Should I expect any trouble to occur between you two? Nah. If Ichi-chan tries to start anything, I'll just discipline her." The redhead assured Naruto with a smirk down at the brunette. Naruto was definitely reminded of a predator that had cornered its prey. All right then. Well, I guess I'll see you later, Kyubi, Naruto said. He decided to quickly get out of there before he either fainted for blood loss or was tempted to join Kyubi in her disciplining. Naruto exited his mindscape and found that arrived in front of a modest 2-story house that definitely looked cozy. He didn't have to wait long for Lee, the gray-haired boy arriving shortly after he did. Together, they entered the house after Naruto unlocked the blood seal on the door, which was meant to keep out unwanted intruders. The two half-devils wandered around the house, finding pictures of Naruto's parents, a couple bedrooms and bathrooms, but nothing out of the ordinary. They met back up in the living room and looked around at the normal-looking setup. There was a couch, a couple chairs along with a coffee table, an empty fireplace with a couple more pictures on the mantle, and coat rack on one of the walls. Naruto carefully scrutinized the living room, searching for a clue that might hint at what his father had hidden in the house. The blue-eyed teen had been looking in the fireplace when Lee entered the room with a bottle of water. His foot caught on the carpet, and the water bottle went flying towards Naruto, who ducked under the impromptu projectile. The Kyubi container was just about to say something when his ears caught the sound of water going down a drain. Naruto looked down at the fireplace and saw that the water from the bottle was trickling down a large grate. Naruto quickly moved the metal rack that would hold the logs out of the way and removed the grate to reveal a ladder descending down below the house. Naruto looked up at Lee with a grin. "I think we go down." Lee nodded with a smile of his own and followed Naruto down the ladder. The two arrived in a small hallway that led to a door that had 2 odd symbols carved into the wood. One was an image of a demonic-looking broadsword and a katana crossed into an X, and the other was a halberd with 2 horns connected to the spear tip with a feathered wing curving up behind the weapon, order of the sword symbol from Devil May Cry 4. Naruto approached the door and tried to turn the doorknob without success. Lee came up and tried to open the door as well, but failed like Naruto. The silver-haired half-devil thought back on his conversation with his father before his eyes widened in realization. He brought out a kunai and slashed his hand, letting the dark red blood run as he placed his hand on the doorknob. Lee, who was about to ask what the heck Naruto was doing, felt his mouth drop when the sound of a lock unlocking echoed throughout the hallway and the door opened to reveal the room beyond. "Ooh, guns. Didn't think they'd survive the rebirth," the Kyubi murmured within Naruto. "Guns?" Naruto mentally asked as he and Lee entered the room that had guns of all kinds lining the walls. Guns are a weapon created by you mortals many millennia ago, before Kami-sama began the rebirth of the world. The red-haired vixen explained before she began listing the types of guns hanging on the wall along with how they worked. Naruto relayed all of the information he received to Lee as the two started studying the various guns to see which one would fit them the best. After careful scrutiny, Naruto ended up selecting two 23 Malawian Quatches pistols that were as black as the darkest void, while Lee pulled down a double-barreled Smith & Wesson Model 500 revolver that had a blue rose printed on the grip of the gun. You can go Google both guns if you need any help visualizing them. Lee looked over at his distant cousin and grinned. Tin-chan would be freaking out right now if she were down here. Naruto chuckled and looked around at the guns. If we ever do bring her down here, I think we should limit her to one gun. The gray-haired genin just laughed as he attached a holster for his pistol on his left hip. She'll probably go on a rampage and turn you into a pincushion if you restrict her to only one weapon, Naruto-kun. Naruto shuddered as he found a suitable holster for his two guns and placed it on the back of his waist. Maybe we shouldn't bring her down here then, he muttered his turn to leave, only to spot a letter resting on a countertop close to the door. He walked over to it and promptly opened it after finding it to be addressed to him. Hello, Sochi. If you're reading this, then that means my plan worked and the QB was stopped. Unfortunately, that also means I must have died along with your mother. I'm sorry to say, son, that she died shortly after you had been born. I'm not sure how since I never received the details, but I have my suspicions that a certain war hawk resting in the roots of Konoha is behind it. Enough of those gloomy thoughts, though. By now, I'm sure you're wondering just what all these things in this room are, right? They're called guns, and they have been passed down through the Namikaze line ever since our ancestor, the legendary Dark Knight Dante, began to collect and store them away. Now, normally, you need to buy or find a way to make enough bullets of all kinds of calibers. The size the bullets would need to be in order to fit into the barrel of the gun. However, since our ancestors managed to save some of the bullets for each type of caliber, I managed to develop a seal that would copy the bullets within the gun. Each and every gun has this seal, along with a seal designed to make them unbreakable, applied to them. If they didn't have the seal, then you would need to reload the gun to replace the spent magazine, the thing that holds the bullets, and put in a new one. Now, all you need to do is to channel a small amount of your chakra into the gun to reload it. Don't worry about getting confused by some of the jargon I've used. I left detailed pictures of all the guns in the room along with an instruction manual to detail how to maintain your gun in my room. Just go to my closet and say, Black Night, Dark Sky, the Devil's Cry. A section of the wall should disappear. Remember this, Naruto. Do not let anyone you don't trust to get their hands on any of these guns. If they fell into the wrong hands, we might have another rebirth on our hands. If you're wondering about this rebirth, head to the library that your mother set up next to our room and look for a book on old legends. You'll find the answer in there. Good luck, Sochi, and be sure to make me a grandfather before you die. With love, Namikaze Minato. Naruto sniffled slightly and handed the letter over to Lee as he took a moment to get a rein on his emotions. Naruto felt Lee's devil bringer on his shoulder and turned to his cousin. Your father was a great man, Naruto. I am sure he would be very proud of everything you've done so far, Lee said solemnly. Naruto nodded, even as tears filled his eyes, and clasped Lee's forearm with the gray-haired boy reciprocating the action. The two stood in a comfortable silence before Naruto smiled and said, We should get some practice in with our guns. Tomorrow we go to find the next Hokage. Lee just nodded and followed Naruto up the ladder. In an unknown location, 7 figures stood gathered in a semicircle. An oppressive silence reigned supreme as none of the black-robed figures spoke. Are the preparations almost completed? One whispered, his voice as cold and rasping as the coldest northern wind. Yes, we are almost ready to raise the tower, another whispered in reply. The first figure suddenly began to laugh, a harsh and rasping sound that would have drained any vestige of happiness from normal people. Soon, Lord Jashin shall return. The sun had just risen over the horizon when Jiraiya came knocking at the house of Minato Namikaze. The white-haired Sannin quickly entered and found the two half-devils snoozing on the couches in the living room. Thankfully, Lee had decided to spend the night at the house. After the two younger shinobi had been woken up by the Toad Sage and gotten dressed, Jiraiya hurried them to the nearest gate since he wanted their departure to be as much of a secret as possible. So it was that the Toad Sannin led the two half-awake teens into the rising of the morning sun. After stopping for breakfast and continuing the monotonous march for another couple hours, Jiraiya directed them off the road to a small clearing. The elder shinobi turned to the younger ones and crossed his arms as he stared at them. "All right, you two. Last night, I went over your records, and while some of your stats are impressive, there's always room for improvement. Now, there's another reason for me picking you two to be the ones to accompany me on this trip aside from getting Tsunade Heim to come back with us. I would like to train the both of you," Jiraiya stated with a small smirk. Two mouths dropped in unison at the statement. The two half-devils looked at each other in astonishment before turning their attention back to the Sannin and asking together, "Really?" Jiraiya nodded and said, "Absolutely. I don't see any reason not to." "Now then, Naruto." The silver-haired Chunin snapped to attention as Jiraiya went on. "I'm going to begin instructing you in the use of a jutsu made famous by your father, the Rasengan." As soon as he said Rasengan, a spiraling blue ball of chakra appeared in his right hand. The white-haired Sannin turned to the nearest tree and thrust the spiraling ball into it. Not even a second later, a section of a tree was grinded into dust. The top part of the tree crashed down onto the stump before toppling backwards. Jiraiya turned to the two awed teens and mentally smirked. "I still got it. That is what will happen if you're able to master the Rasengan. Just imagine what must happen to the insides of a human." Jiraiya's expression turned serious. "Naruto, this technique is very dangerous, even as a glancing blow. I want you to promise me that you won't use it in a spar against a fellow Konoha shinobi." Naruto nodded seriously. "I promise, sensei." Jiraiya nodded back before he pulled a bag full of balloons from somewhere. Right then, after Minato finished creating this stage of the Rasengan, he devised an easier way for others to learn to use it based on three properties: rotation, power, and control. This is the first stage. He pulled out a balloon and filled it with water. The two genin watched as bumps appeared all along the surface of the balloon before it burst apart. As you might be able to tell, this exercise deals with rotation. Jiraiya continued to explain after a couple seconds of silence. "You will need to spin the chakra through the water to rotate it enough to pop the balloon. It will help greatly if you do multiple rotations." Naruto nodded and filled up his own balloon before moving to the side of the clearing to begin working on it. Once Naruto had moved off, Jiraiya turned to Lee. "All right then, Lee. I know that you can't gather enough chakra in order to use any external jutsu, so I'll just have to teach you one that enhances a part of your body," the white-haired Sannin said. He sped through a series of hand seals and shouted, "Ninpu! Hari! Jaizu!" His white hair lengthened to cover his whole body and grew even spikier. Lee walked over and flicked one of the spikes. "Wow, it's as hard as a rock." Jiraiya released the technique and nodded. "Yup. I don't think you'll be able to get your hair to grow any longer, but you should be able to sharpen or harden your hair. I doubt anybody would be prepared for that, especially in close-quarters combat." He slowly went through the series of hand seals needed for the technique a couple times so that Lee could see as he explained, "What you need to do is form these hand seals and then send your chakra into your hair while focusing on either making it harder or sharper. Don't be discouraged if you don't get on your first try. Just try harder to get it right." Lee nodded and moved off to his own section of the clearing to try out the jutsu. For the next couple of hours, Jiraiya would move between the two half-devils and offer advice or tips to help them out when they struggled. After a while, Jiraiya called them to him and started them on some light taijutsu sparring, and then they moved on to sparring with their weapons. After taking a short break to rest up, Jiraiya got them back on the road again, claiming that if they hurried, they could make it to the first town before it got dark out. A couple minutes passed in peaceful silence before Lee turned to Naruto. "Naruto-kun, yesterday in the Hokage's office you mentioned that you knew what it felt like to be in love with a girl, but she was lost to you and you were never able to tell her how you felt about her. I was wondering if you would share that tale with me now." Naruto's good mood vanished in the blink of an eye, and he went extremely silent. Just when Lee had turned away from him, thinking that the blue-eyed Chunin wouldn't answer, Naruto began to speak. "When I was young, before I had even entered the Shinobi Academy, I often spent a majority of my time out on the streets. One day, I was walking through the seedier section of Konoha when I saw this guy standing over these two kids with a broken beer bottle in his hand. I moved closer and saw that one of the kids was bleeding from a cut on his head, while the other, his sister, was crying and trying to back away from the drunk. I grabbed the nearest thing I could, which was this rotting block of wood that had a nail sticking out of it, and rushed over. I swung the wood as hard as I could right into the man's back. He fell silent for a moment before he whispered, "It was the first time I ever killed another person." Both Lee and Jiraiya turned to look back at Naruto, whose eyes had lowered to the ground as he became lost in his memories as they kept walking. To be honest, I felt glad that man was dead because of what he was doing. I think that kill will be the only one I won't feel guilty about in some way. Anyways, after I killed that man, I brought the other two back to my apartment and went to get G-San so that he could bring his personal doctor. Once the two of them had been seen to by G-San's doctor, we started hanging out together and became as thick as thieves. I'm not sure when it started, but the boy and I started calling each other brother. Then I joined the Shinobi Academy, but they didn't because they told me that they didn't want to be held down in one single village when they got older. When my final year in the academy came along, we ran into this guy who sort of took us on as his students. He taught us all about fighting with swords, as well as a world that I now know to be the demon world. It was around that time that I began to fall in love with my brother's sister. Naruto paused to take a sip from his canteen. But one day, before I could tell her, the three of us were sparring at one of the training grounds, and we were attacked by these strange creatures. I'm pretty sure now that they were low-level demons. We fought frantically and got separated. Just when I thought I was going to die, our sensei showed up and defeated the demons. After the last demon had been vanished, we found that she was gone. I wanted to go out looking for her, but my sensei and the one I called brother said it was foolish, that she had most likely either been killed or taken to the demon world. After that day, my brother disappeared from Konoha, and my sensei left shortly after. Naruto looked up at Lee with tears lining his eyes, and not a single day has gone by where I haven't wished that I could have told her how I feel. Both Lee and Jiraiya were struck silent by the tale before the white-haired Sannin looked forward and said, "Look sharp, boys. We're coming up on the first town." Both teens turned their attention to the road in front of them, Naruto wiping the tears from his eyes. The two half-devils let out small gasps of astonishment when they came up on the town. It looked like a sinkhole had tried to suck the land down deep into the earth, but gave up, leaving a gigantic hole in the ground. A city had been built in the hole and grew larger until it spanned the entire bottom part of the hole from one side of it to the other. Some of the tips of the tops of buildings barely managed to reach above the level of the rest of the land outside the hole. Welcome to Funkakito Kai. Slashing. As far as my limited knowledge goes, those two words translate to Crater City. If I'm wrong, please let me know, Jiraiya said. It's our first stop on our search for Tsunadeheim. Hopefully I'll be able to get a better lead on her whereabouts here. With that, he began to lead them down into the city, down a long stairway that snaked down the rock wall. When the three finally made it down the long stairs, the two boys' heads were turning in every direction since there was apparently some sort of festival going on. Jiraiya led the two half-devils to a nearby inn and checked them into a room. The three dropped off their bags and relaxed for a bit on the beds. After a while of quiet relaxation, Jiraiya sat up. "All right, you two, I'm going to head out to try and gather some information on Tsunadeheim's whereabouts. You two can go exploring if you want, but stay together and make sure to come back here before nightfall," the white-haired toad Sannin instructed. After getting a nod from the two teens, he promptly left the room. Naruto and Lee, after making sure they had all their weapons on them, exited the room as well. The two teens were intent on enjoying themselves. Little did they know their R&R would be cut short. In an unknown location somewhere, in Funkaku Tokai, 6 figures all garbed in pitch-black robes stood in a wide circle around a tome that was set on a pedestal. The 6 robed men spread out their arms wide and began chanting in an evil, ominous language. As they chanted, a 7th figure came walking up, pushing before him a blindfolded and gagged young woman. When he reached the book, the other 6 picked up the pace and volume of their chanting. The 7th man waited for a couple moments before he pulled out a dagger and shouted something in an unknown language. Directly after he finished his shout, the black-robed man slit the throat of the woman and bent her forward so that her blood would fall onto the tome. When the flow of the red liquid slowed to a stop, The woman's body was tossed aside as the chanting of the six figures quieted. In darkness of the room, the tome began to glow with a black and red light. Back with Lee and Naruto, the two half-devils froze in mid-step and looked around in suspicion. Something was prickling at their nerves, something malicious and oppressive. It was hard pinpoint because it's so faint, but both felt like something really bad was going to happen soon. "Do you feel that, Lee?" Naruto quietly asked as the two resumed walking, both of them noting how none of the civilians milling about seemed to be affected by whatever it was the two half-devils felt. The gray-haired teen nodded. "I do, Naruto-kun. I'm not sure what it is, but whatever it is feels somewhat similar to Gara-san before you fought against him." "Do you think there's another container here?" The silver-haired teen shook his head. "No, it feels different, uncontained, and more powerful than what I felt when I fought against Gara. We should be on our guard. It's possibly just a low-level demon, so dash." Naruto was cut off as the ground began to shake. Screaming and yelling erupted all throughout the town as stalls were knocked down by the shaking of the earth. Suddenly, the sounds of the screaming intensified as an old and decrepit tower began to emerge right in the center of the city, destroying many of the buildings located there. Higher and higher it rose, reaching up as if to make a bridge to the heavens themselves. As it rose up, the clouds began to gather and darken to a blood-red color. The tower came to a stop, ominously looming over the crater city as red lightning began to flash in the blood-red clouds. Naruto looked over at Lee. "Well, at least now we know what we were sensing. The question is, what is it?" Came a serious voice behind the two teens. Naruto and Lee turned and saw Jiraiya standing there, staring up at the tower. The white-haired Sannin looked down at Naruto and asked, "Does the Kyuubi know anything about this?" Naruto closed his eyes and opened his mental link to the nine-tailed fox. "Kyuubi, can you hear me?" "Yanum, yes. What is it, Naruto-kun?" The nine-tailed vixen asked. A giant, old-looking tower just rose up out of the ground. "It has a demonic feel to it. Do you know anything about it?" The blue-eyed Chunin asked as he allowed the Kyuubi to see his memory of the rising tower. The vixen was silent for a moment before she grimly replied, "That is the Teminen Ajuryu, a tower that connects the human world with the demon world. Thankfully, higher-level demons or devils can only cross over if they're summoned by the one who raised the tower, but the lower-level demons can cross over outside of the tower by themselves. Of course, they're extremely weak compared to some of the others because of that. However, only those of demon or devil heritage can enter the tower. Apparently, some fool either wants to bring a demon to this world, or is just plain insane." Arigato, Kyuubi. Naruto cut the mental connection. He turned to Jiraiya and began to relay the information he just learned. When the silver-haired teen was done, Jiraiya wrote something down on a scroll before he drew an odd-looking seal into the dirt and placed the scroll onto the seal while channeling his chakra, making the scroll disappear in a cloud of smoke. After scraping out the seal, Jiraiya began speaking. "All right, I just sent a message to Sir Toby-sensei, so hopefully we'll be reinforced with a contingent of Umbu and Jounin soon. Now then, does the Kyuubi know of any way to remove the tower?" Naruto closed his eyes and quickly conversed with the bijou within him. After a minute, he nodded and opened his eyes. "Yes. Kyuubi says that Lee and I need to go into the tower and kill the one who summoned the Teminen Igru. Once the summoner is dead, the tower should disappear since its connection to the world would no longer be present." "What can you expect to encounter in there?" the Toad Sage asked. The blue-eyed half-devil closed his eyes once more. "At best, 2 or 3 devils. At worst, the Lord of Hell," Naruto responded after getting the answer from a Kyuubi. "Not to mention all the low-level demons we're going to have to fight through along the way." Jiraiya nodded. "Okay then. Be careful and watch each other's backs. I don't fancy being the one to have to tell your girlfriends you died." "Don't worry, Jiraiya-sensei. Naruto-kun and I will not fail," Lee replied with a thumbs up. At Jiraiya's nod, both teens drew their respective swords and began making their way to the tower. As they made their way to the Teminen Igru, Naruto and Lee began to hear the sound of screaming once again. The two teens rounded the corner and saw a group of civilians being attacked by odd skeleton-like creatures that wore purple robes and wielded scythes. Those are some of the low-level demons I was telling you about. Naruto-kun, the Kyuubi informed Naruto. They are known as Hell Prides, one member of the Seven Hells Army. On their own, they're fairly weak compared to you or Lee, but like all rabble, if you get them into a large enough group, they can become dangerous. Naruto nodded and informed Lee as the two rushed forward. Lee went first, revving up his sword before he started to spin once he reached the prides. The gray-haired teen slid across the ground as his flaming blade easily sliced through a couple of the demons. Naruto followed Lee by jumping high into the air and bringing his Zweihander down on the last pride, completely cutting it in half down the middle. Naruto turned to the civilians still cowering on the ground and shouted, "Go and head in the opposite direction of the tower." Seeing their confused looks, Naruto continued, "We're shinobi from Konohagakure, and we're going to try to get rid of that tower. Now go." The civilians nodded and took off running. Naruto turned his attention back to Lee, and, with a shared nod, the two resumed their hurried trek to the Temen-Nigiryu, Naruto sheathing Kitsune and pulling out his twin pistols as he ran. Along the way, the two half-devils encountered more prides, along with a new demon that the Kyuubi identified as Lust that were slightly faster than the prides, as well as more acrobatic. Lee rushed in once again, engaging in close-quarters combat, while Naruto hung back and picked off the demons at long range with his pistols, sometimes charging his guns with his devil chakra to increase their power. Soon, after demolishing many prides and lusts, the two half-devils made it to the base of the Temen-Nigiryu. Before they could enter the structure, though, an ominous bell tolled, followed by a high-pitched screech. Acting on a sudden instinct, the two rolled to opposite sides to dodge the large scythe that suddenly came crashing down on where they just stood. The half-devils looked up at their attacker. It looked like a larger version of the prides, and its scythe was glowing with a sickly purple color. It was known as a Hell Vanguard. They watched as it twirled the scythe over its head and vanished. Naruto and Lee quickly stood up and started scanning the area around them, not noticing the rippling ground at their feet. Suddenly, an unseen bell tolled once again, followed by the vanguard shooting up out of the ground with its scythe spinning, catching both of the half-devils off guard and launching them both into the wall of the building. Naruto switched to his other devil arm and hurled a shield at the vanguard, slashing off one of its arms. While the demon was screeching its head off, Lee rushed up and slashed off the other arm. Naruto switched back to Kitsune and launched a crescent of blue flames at the vanguard, dispersing it into a pile of sand. After taking a moment to catch their breath, the two half-devils finally entered the Temen-Nigiryu. Immediately upon entering, they were assaulted by an icy cold wind. The two looked around at their surroundings and noticed that ice covered all the walls, including the ceiling. After waiting a moment in case of an ambush, the two shinobi of Konoha started walking across the room to where a giant ice sculpture of a three-headed dog lay. When they had gotten halfway across the floor, though, the statue began to crack and ice started breaking off of the dog. Suddenly, a tremendous burst of ice launched directly towards the two half-devils. Both of them drew their swords and slashed down on the ice, speeding towards them. "Leave this place, mortals!" The two half-devils looked up and saw that the statue of the three-headed dog was now moving, but it was kept from going far by the collar that connected it to the wall. "The likes of you are not welcome here. You, who are powerless, should leave while you can." "Well, this certainly isn't something you see every day, Lee?" Naruto asked as he looked at his cousin. The gray-haired teen nodded. "Indeed, Naruto-kun. A talking three-headed would most definitely be out of the ordinary." The two half-devils both jumped to the side as a column of icy wind struck the spot where they had stood just moments before, completely sealing off the entrance to the Temen-Nigiryu. "You mortals dare make a mockery of me," the three heads of the Cerberus roared. "Prepare yourselves, for you shall meet your end here." Naruto looked over at Lee and gestured at the three-headed devil dog. "Why don't you take this one, Lee? He doesn't seem too tough." Lee just nodded and moved forward while drawing out his revolver. The green-eyed genin started firing bullets at the large dog, chipping away at the ice that clung to its body. Soon Lee spotted an opening and quickly rushed in, switching his gun out for his sword, and attacked one of the Cerberus's legs. One of the heads retaliated by blowing a stream of ice down at the floor that would have surely frozen. Lee had the half-devil not leap high into the air. As he fell back to the floor, Lee revved his sword before he sliced down hard into the Cerberus's leg. The flames generated added to the damage. A deep gash opened up on the giant dog's leg that forced it down to the floor, its head's in reach of Lee's sword. The gray-haired genin rushed in, Red Queen blazing hotter than a high-level fire jutsu, and proceeded to launch into a fast combo that made it seem like Lee was twirling a whip made of flame around in dizzying patterns. If the roars it was making were any indication, then this attack was causing the three-headed dog a great deal of pain. Suddenly, the Cerberus launched up onto its hind legs, throwing Lee backwards before it came crashing back down. Giant spikes of ice erupted from the ground when the dog's feet met the floor, nearly skewering the green-eyed half-devil who leapt above them at the last second. As he fell back to the Cerberus's leftmost head, Lee cocked back his devil bringer and channeled his devil chakra into it. When he reached the head, the green-eyed half-devil let loose a powerful punch that completely shattered the head. While the now two-headed dog was mourning over the loss of one of its heads, Lee quickly executed a combat roll to the rightmost head and stabbed upwards with his brightly glowing sword, which plunged deeply into the head. After twisting the blade around, Lee ripped it out and watched as this head broke off into tiny pieces of ice. The Cerberus collapsed down to its knees in pain as the final head stared into Lee's eyes. "You are not human, are you?" the devil asked in a pain-filled voice. Lee shook his head. "Once I was, but no longer. Regardless, you have proved your strength." The Cerberus began glowing light blue as it raised its head to the sky. "Take my soul and go forth. You have my blessing." With one last roar, the Cerberus burst apart and left behind only a light blue orb. Lee stretched out his devil bringer and watched as the orb slowly floated to his outstretched arm. When it finally reached his palm, the green-eyed half-devil slowly closed his demonic hand around the orb, causing it to disappear in a bright flash of light. When the light faded away, Lee's arm didn't look any different, but suddenly gripped by a flash of inspiration, Lee slammed his devil bringer on the ground while thinking about the soul of the devil he had just obtained. Spikes of ice erupted in a circle around Lee before fading away. Lee turned to his cousin and gave him a thumbs up, with Naruto returning the gesture. The two then made their way to the doorway that was now visible since the Cerberus was no longer in the way. In a different part of the Temenin IGRU, it seems we have some intruders. Out of the 7 figures we had last seen, only 2 were still able to survive the process of summoning the tower. Indeed, I suppose we should welcome them. Even though the 2 figures' facial features were completely covered, the evil smirks they gave off could still be felt. Jashin-sama will be pleased to find entertainment waiting for him when he crosses. Back with Naruto and Lee. Naruto grunted as he launched himself off the wall and went halfway through a backflip. Without pause, he drew out his pistols and started to spin. Soon his fingers were rapidly pulling the triggers. A staccato of thunder accompanied the rain of metal that pelted the small group of prides, shortly turning them back to the sand that they were made of. Naruto gave off a small grunt as landed back on his feet. The blue-eyed Chunin looked over at his cousin in time to see him swing the red-hued sword like it was a bat, sending a lust crashing against a wall. Naruto sighed as he holstered his guns and stretched out his sore shoulders. Recently, the 2 half-devils had just defeated a giant flying centipede that sent the 2 flying into the wall a couple times before Naruto had gone into his devil trigger and slammed his Zweihander straight through the gigapede's skull. Lee placed his sword in its spot on his back and just followed his cousin as they exited the hallway before emerging out on a walking on the outside of the tower, almost halfway up it. Looking down, they could see flashes of fire or other elements, which let them know that the reinforcement from Konoha had arrived. The gray-haired genin looked over at his cousin as he said, "I think we should hurry, Naruto-kun. Even if they are Jounin and Umbu, I doubt they'll be able to hold out for a long time against the demons." Naruto just nodded in response to Lee's statement. Without another word, the two continued along the walkway before they came to a small alcove that had a dark iron double door resting in it. The two half-devils looked at each other before they each pushed up against one of the doors and entered the room on the other side. It was a large square room with chains hanging across the ceiling and the walls appearing to be made of iron bones. The two shinobi of Konoha noticed a large door on the other side of the room and began making their way towards it. But before they had even crossed half of the room, a voice coming from above brought the two to a stop. "Look, brother, it's been ages, but we finally have visitors." The two half-devils looked up at where the voice was coming from and saw an impossibly muscular blue body, holding a serrated blue sword in its grip, sitting calmly on a large column. "I see that," another voice shouted. Naruto and Lee turned to the other column and saw a similar figure to the first, except this one was primarily red, sitting there in the same position as the blue figure. "We must entertain our guests," the blue figure said. "Yes, we have to be gracious hosts," the red one replied. So what should we do?" the blue one asked. "I don't know. You're supposed to be the smart one," the red figure shouted in anger. As the two figures continued to argue with each other, Lee felt a sweat drop grow on the back of his head while Naruto clenched his teeth in anger before he suddenly sighed explosively. At once, both figures ceased speaking. "Brother, our guest is sighing," the blue figure stated. The red one answered, "You know, you never did answer me before when I asked what a sigh was." "Well, a sigh is when dash." The blue figure was cut off by Naruto. "Enough already." Seeing that he had the two figures' attention, the Chunin continued speaking. "Look, in case you two don't get it, I'll spell it out for you. Your guests want to go through." "Got it." All was silent for a moment before a rumbling could be heard as the two figures stood, revealing that their heads were actually connected to the hilts of their swords instead of their bodies. "Our job here is to guard this door," the red head said. "That's right. We cannot let you pass," the blue head stated. With that, the two devils leapt down from their perches. Naruto and Lee both jumped backwards to give themselves a little space. Both watched in silence as the red devil's sword became covered in flames, while the blue devil's sword became surrounded by a miniature tornado. The two half-devils readied their own blades as they tensed their muscles in preparation. The B.D, blue devil, charged first, coming in with a low slash that Naruto blocked with Kitsune, while Lee moved forward as he slashed to the B.D sword arm. Before he could connect, both Naruto and Lee rolled to the side as the R.D, red devil, came falling down from above. The BD howled in pain as the RD's sword accidentally hit it. The two devils quickly fell into a brawl amongst themselves as Lee and Naruto stared on with sweat drops rolling down their heads. Naruto turned to his cousin and said, "We need to split them up. You take the red one, your ice should beat his fire, and I'll take the blue one. With my devil trigger, I should be able to finish him quickly." Lee just nodded to show he understood the plan. Without wasting a second, Naruto activated his devil trigger and shoulder rushed the BD. Before the RD could react, Lee came rushing in with his devil bringer covered in a thick layer of ice and slugged the RD hard, causing it to go flying away from the BD. Despite having a larger sword, Naruto was able to keep up with the speed being set by the BD. Finally, after a couple minutes of bone-jarring sword clashes, Naruto managed to knock the BD's sword out of its grasp. The silver-haired half-devil quickly cut a large diagonal gash across the BD's chest before spinning and plunging the blade all the way through the devil's body. Meanwhile, Lee was easily able to outpace the RD's speed and managed to land multiple punches on the devil's body, slowly covering it in ice. When he judged there to be enough ice on the RD's body, Lee slashed of its sword arm before he gathered his devil chakra into his devil bringer and slammed it into the ice-crusted body. Both of the half-devils backed off from the disintegrating bodies of their foes and started to head to the door before they heard a voice shout, "Wait!" The two shinobi of Konoha turned back and saw that the two swords still remained. The head of the red sword started talking. "Yes, please wait. We have been waiting a long time," the blue head said. "A very long time indeed," agreed the red head. "For someone stronger than us." The blue head began. Naruto's and Lee's necks were starting to hurt from going back and forth. "Someone who could wield us," the red head finished. "My name is Agni, and my name is Rudra," the blue head said. "You shall take us with you." The two heads said together. We could be a great help to you. Naruto looked over at Lee with an eyebrow raised. The gray-haired half-devil simply shrugged his shoulders. Naruto turned back to the two swords. All right, but on one condition. What is it? Agni asked. Name it. Rudra said immediately after the red sword. Naruto walked closer to the two swords as he said, I'm sure that you've been around for a long time and that you guys have been in a whole lot of fights. My condition is this. Outside of a battle, no talking. When I'm engaged with an enemy, though, you can give me tips or whatever to help me beat my opponent. Rudra hummed in thought. That is certainly better than the condition our previous wielder gave. Your condition is accepted. Agni voiced his agreement. Naruto picked up the two swords and started swinging them around in a complex maneuver. He then joined the two swords at the hilts and started spinning them around his body, sending off crescents of fire and wind. The silver-haired Chunin then started spinning, creating a tornado of fire before coming to a stop and spinning in the opposite direction, launching a wave of wind. As he came to a stop, Rudra muttered, Impressive. Naruto straightened up and clanked the two head together. No, talking, he sternly said. After a moment of silence, Naruto nodded. Good. The silver-haired Chunin then switched the twin swords for Kitsune and turned to his cousin. Seeing the small smirk on Lee's face, Naruto just flipped him a bird before going through the doors with Lee following him. That's it for today. I will stop here. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you please consider subscribe and make sure to hit that like button, share with your friends, and don't forget to check out author of this story. Details in description.